It was a bright spring afternoon when 18-year-old Julie Connell decided to spend a quiet day at the park, her favorite book in hand. She was a straight-A student, a loving sister, and a young woman with a future full of possibilities. But when her family came to pick her up, she wasn't there. Julie had vanished. Hours and hours go by, and there is still no sign of Julie. What began as a hopeful search soon spiraled into every parent's worst nightmare. How could a vibrant young woman disappear with no one even noticing? As her family and the community fought to uncover the truth, this case took twists and turns that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. What happened to Julie Connell that day in the park? That answer would take decades to uncover. Let me introduce you to Julie Connell. Imagine that friend that you always look up to. The one who has everything figured out. They're smart, put together, and full of potential. That was Julie. She was born on April 15th, 1966, and she was the oldest daughter of Jim and Kathy Connell. She was born in San Leandro, California. In the 1980s, it was the kind of place where families felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Nestled in the San Francisco Bay Area, the suburban streets were lined with well-kept lawns, children playing outside, and the comforting sound of neighbors exchanging greetings with one another. For the Connell family, their home at 1593 Vining Street was a haven of love and security. It was a cozy suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where, as I said, kids would go and play outside until the streetlights came on. The biggest neighborhood drama was whose lawn got TP'd during homecoming. Julie took full advantage of that stability, focusing on her studies and her hobbies. Right from the start, Julie was an overachiever. She had this quiet determination and a spark about her that made people notice her. Her younger sisters, Wendy and Patricia, practically worshipped her. Julie was a straight-A student at Arroyo High School in San Lorenzo, California, and she wasn't just good at school. She was great at school. She was so academically inclined. She was the kind of girl who would make flashcards for fun. Her teachers adored her, and her classmates saw her as someone they could count on to be kind and genuine. And it wasn't just about the books. Julie was the whole package. She loved writing, acting, and she dreamed of one day being in broadcasting. It's the 1980s, and Julie's life is like a John Hughes movie, but without the angsty teen drama. She had her high school sweetheart, Tom O'Neill, who was a little older than her. He was 20, a college guy, and they were cute. They hung out together all the time, laughed together, and enjoyed each other's company. When Julie turned 18 on April 15th of 1984, that was a huge deal. 18 is the age when you start to feel like I'm an adult now. She had just purchased her cap and gown for graduation and put a deposit down for a class trip to Disneyland. Julie spent the day with her boyfriend Tom, just celebrating, because just a few months earlier, she had been accepted into California State University at Hayward. She had big goals, and honestly, no one doubted that she would achieve all of them. Julie wasn't just book smart, though. She was thoughtful, caring, and she spent time volunteering at her local church, reading Bible stories to kids. She was the kind of person you just felt good being around. Her family, her friends, everyone who knew her saw that she was on the brink of something great. Julie wasn't just a girl with dreams. She was a sister, a daughter, and a friend, like us. That's why her story really hits home. A young woman with her life ahead of her, living her best life, completely unaware of the danger that was lurking in what should have been one of the safest spaces. Her story isn't just about what happened to her. It's about who she was. This vibrant, ambitious girl deserved to grow up, to live out her dreams, and to see where her life would take her. It was April 20th, 1984, Easter weekend. A time for pastel dresses, egg hunts, and, honestly, just soaking up the early spring weather in California. The Connell family had plans for a relaxing, wholesome afternoon. Kathy, Julie's mom, wanted to take her 3 daughters to see the movie Police Academy at the Festival Cinema, family bonding over popcorn and laughs during spring break. But Julie had already seen it. She had other plans that day. Julie was the type of girl who always had her priorities in order. While her sisters, 15-year-old Wendy and 12-year-old Patricia, were excited for the movie, Julie decided to use that time to catch up on her schoolwork. College was around the corner and she wasn't about to slack off now, especially since she had a test on Monday. She packed her essentials, a book she was reading for class called A Face of a Hero, a blanket, some lunch, and her trusty lavender USA t-shirt, paired with blue jeans, white tennis shoes, and cute bobby socks. Her style was comfy and practical, which was so Julie. Kennedy Park was just across the street from the movie theater, and that was her destination. It was the perfect spot, a quiet little park where you could stretch out on the grass and get lost in a good book. Julie told her mom, "Pick me up here when the movie's over." With that, they dropped her off around 1 p.m., never imagining that it would be the last time they saw her. At the park, Julie set up her little study station like the straight-A student she was. She spread out her blanket, pulled out her book, and got to work. Her sister Wendy hung out for a bit, waiting for the movie to start. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. The sun was out, people were around, and it felt like an ordinary day. But when the movie was over and Kathy and the girls went back to the park, Julie wasn't there. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Maybe she wandered off to grab something to eat, or she got bored and went home early. Kathy searched the park, calling out Julie's name, but there was no sign of her. Not the blanket, not the book, nothing. The time they got home, Kathy was expecting to see Julie waiting for them, ready with one of those, "Oh, I just decided to leave early," explanations. But the house was silent. Julie wasn't there, and with each passing minute the worry started to set in. Jim Connell, Julie's dad, got home from work and immediately noticed that something was off. Julie not being there, that wasn't like her. At first he was annoyed. "Why couldn't she have just called," he said, "and let us know where she was?" But the irritation quickly turned into something darker, a pit in his stomach kind of dread. The Connells started calling everyone they could think of, Julie's friends, her boyfriend Tom, anyone who might have seen or heard from her. But there was nothing. No one had any idea where she was. By nighttime, the fear had taken over. They tried calling local hospitals, hoping for some sort of news about their daughter, but it was no use. Julie was gone. When they reached out to the police, they were told the worst thing possible. Because Julie had just turned 18, the police couldn't file a missing persons report for at least 72 hours. Now, I'm sure most of you know by now that that is not true. Not these days. These days you can 100% file a missing persons report right away. But back then, this was the norm. 72 hours. That's a lifetime when someone you love has gone missing. The police suggested that maybe Julie had run away or was just out having fun. But the Connells knew their daughter. Julie wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to just disappear without telling someone. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong, and they just couldn't sit around and do nothing. So, they did what any desperate family would do. They organized their own search party. Handwriting over 2,000 flyers, they plastered Julie's face across the community, begging for help. They combed through Kennedy Park, every street, every corner of their town, hoping for a clue. That Sunday, Easter morning, the Connells went to church, trying to find some comfort. But during the service, Jim felt something really odd. He felt this cold, heavy wave of despair come over him, and it shook him up. It was like a voice whispering that Julie wasn't coming home. He ended up admitting this later, but in the moment, of course, he kept quiet because he was hopeful and moved forward, trying to locate his teenage daughter. But can you imagine? Maybe it was like a gut feeling or some kind of intuitive sense that he had. Still, the family pushed on. There was no other choice. Julie was out there somewhere, and they had to find her no matter what. But they needed help. What had started as a simple spring day had turned into every family's nightmare. They were living a family's worst fears, and the clock was ticking. By the third day, the Connells were running on nothing but adrenaline and pure desperate hope. Julie had been missing for 72 hours now. That's 3 days of searching parks, knocking on doors, and dialing numbers in the middle of the night, praying that someone, anyone, had seen her. 3 days of replaying every detail, asking, "What are we missing?" The police finally agreed to open an investigation, but their initial response was cold, detached, and way too casual. They said, "She's probably just with friends, maybe she ran away." Imagine it being your own daughter, your loved one, the straight A, responsible, just turned 18, excited about college type of girl, and they were sitting there dismissing her like she was just out partying. Well, the Connells weren't having it. They knew that something was wrong. On Easter Sunday, while all these other families were dyeing eggs and planning family dinners, the Connells were handing out missing person flyers. Julie's face was everywhere now, in store windows, on telephone poles, even on car windshields. Her father, Jim, was on local television, practically begging the community for help. "We're looking for Julie," he said. "We're not looking for a body. We're looking for our daughter." It wasn't just the family searching. The entire community came together. Strangers showed up with flashlights, with boots on, combing through Kennedy Park and the surrounding neighborhoods. Psychics reached out with visions, and search dogs were brought in to sniff out a trace of Julie. It was a whirlwind of effort, but none of it brought any answers. Then came the first clue. A woman called the police after seeing Julie's disappearance on the news, and she thought she found something. It was a book thrown into the bushes on her front porch. It was the same book Julie had taken to the park, A Face of a Hero. The woman noticed that the book had been taken out of the Royal High School library, which she knew from the news that Julie attended. Recognizing the significance of this discovery, she decided to contact the police. She wondered, how did it get there? Who just threw it away like that? Surely not Julie. Before detectives could make sense of any of this, another call came in. Another woman and her daughter had been walking not too far from the park when they spotted a lavender shirt and a bra just lying in the street. The shirt matched the one that Julie had been wearing, and the bra was cut down the middle. The straps were ripped. It was the evidence that no one wanted to find because it meant that something bad could have happened to Julie. When police brought the shirt and the bra to the Connell home, Kathy and Jim could barely look. They knew instantly that they were Julie's. For Jim, seeing the shredded fabric was almost too much. "She's in trouble," he told them, his voice breaking. He knew she was really, really in trouble. But even then, the Connells refused to give up. Until they found her, they had to believe that she was still alive. 2 days later, 2 teenage girls came forward with another clue. Julie's backpack was found. They admitted they found it under a payphone at a 7-Eleven, but they had gone through it. They were admittedly looking for anything valuable, and then tossing the other items they didn't want from their moving car window as they drove away. The teenage girls said that they later saw the news about Julie's disappearance and how she had a backpack with her at the time. This realization prompted the friends to think the bag might hold some important value, some evidence. So when they heard this, they told one of their sisters, and the sister advised them to call the police to tell them what they found. After the police picked up the backpack from the teenage girls, they were able to confirm that it belonged to Julie Connell. And inside was Julie's blanket, but there was nothing else to indicate what had happened to her or where she might be now. Each of these clues was like another breadcrumb, a little bit of hope mixed with fear. Then, 5 days after Julie vanished, on April 25th, the call they had been dreading came in. A rancher and his wife were out tending to their cattle in a remote part of Castro Valley, approximately 20 minutes away from Kennedy Park, where Julie was last seen. The rancher explained that they were there to bring their cattle down from the mountain into a small, remote corral. The couple stumbled upon a shocking sight, the body of a young woman. She was inside the corral, lying in the open, exposed to the elements, and nude from the waist up, clearly no longer alive. They were unable to process what they had just witnessed, but they quickly made the decision to ride to their neighbor's house and call the police. When investigators arrived at the scene, the location itself set an eerie tone. This corral was rugged. It was surrounded by hills and dense brush and far from any busy roads or residential areas. It was the kind of place that no one would just stumble upon unless they were there for a specific reason. It was isolated, quiet, and unfortunately the perfect location for someone to try to hide a crime. As officers approached the body, it was clear that they were dealing with a homicide. The woman had no identification on her, but the detectives had this gut feeling that it would be Julie Connell. The upper part of the body was bruised and bloodied. Her throat was wounded from ear to ear, slashed. Her left wrist was bound tightly with an elaborate type of knot, wrapped 12 times with some kind of cord. Her right arm was nearly severed. It appeared that the killer had tried to restrain her with such violence that the ligature cut into her flesh. The condition of her body told a very tragic story right away. There were defensive wounds that covered her hands and her arms, a clear indication that she had fought back with everything she had. There were bruises on her torso and abrasions on her knees, which made it look like she was dragged or thrown down before her life was taken. When they got closer, they realized that her killer had slit her throat 3 times, an act of pure rage, or maybe a deliberate attempt to silence her forever. Investigators combed through that corral, leaving no stone unturned. They worked methodically, moving shoulder to shoulder across the whole field, documenting every inch of that scene. Near the gate to the corral, they discovered muddy footprints on the second rail of the gate. It looked like someone had climbed over the gate. The pattern was distinct enough for them to take note for potential analysis. On the ground near the gate, they found something very chilling, a small cellophane package that had once held a disposable scalpel. The packaging had a red smear on it, which they suspected might be blood. Investigators also found several sets of fingerprints on the gate itself, and they hoped that this would lead them to a major break in the investigation. As they analyzed the soil around the body, it became clear that Julie had been killed in the corral itself. Blood had soaked deeply into the ground, a quantity that would have been impossible for her body to have been moved there after her death. There were also no drag marks around her, no disturbed grass or dirt to suggest that the body had been transported there. Every piece of evidence pointed to this being the location where her life was taken. Despite the lack of proof, the officers at the scene had a gut feeling that this woman could be the missing girl, Julie Connell. At 2 a.m., the Connell family's phone rang. Jim and Kathy Connell answered, their hearts heavy with dread. It was the call no one wanted to get. On the line was a detective from the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. His voice was steady but carried the weight of devastating news. A young woman's body had been found, and they needed the Connells to identify it. They prayed silently, hoping that the police had not found their Julie. The next thing they knew, there were officers at their front door. They let them inside, and one of the officers handed them an envelope. Inside were snapshots of a woman's body that had been found. Jim was the first to look. It was Julie. Her features were unmistakable to him, even in the grainy images. The tears came instantly. Jim could hardly bear the weight of this realization that his daughter was gone. "It's her," he whispered. "It's Julie." Then it was Kathy's turn. She was sitting in Julie's room on her bed when they handed her the photos. She too cried as soon as she saw them. Kathy and Jim were devastated. Then the officers handed the parents something else, a dime. It was the only item besides her clothing that was found on her body. A single dime. Kathy had taught all of her daughters to always carry a dime with them because at the time, that was the cost of a call from a payphone. The Connell family was now faced with the additional challenge of breaking the news to their younger daughters, Patricia and Wendy. 12-year-old Patricia, Julie's youngest sister, remembers her mom breaking the news. She said, "Your sister is dead," while holding her hand. Patricia said she knew what that meant in the moment, but she struggled to make sense of it. What did it even mean? What was she supposed to do now, she wondered. For Wendy, the last family member to see Julie alive, the guilt and grief were overwhelming. She kept replaying that last moment in her mind countless times. Julie lying peacefully on her blanket, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The loss shattered the Connell family. Julie was the glue that held them together. The big sister Wendy and Patricia adored. The girl who brought joy into every room she walked into. And now she was gone. For Jim and Kathy, the grief was unbearable, but somehow they managed to keep going. For Wendy, for Patricia, and for Julie. They didn't just want justice, they needed it. Whatever happened, whoever did this to her, they weren't going to let it end here. But their nightmare had only just begun. Julie Connell's body was transported from the corral in Castro Valley to the Alameda County Coroner's Office, where the full scope of the violence she endured finally came to light. The autopsy revealed a brutal story, a grim narrative of her final hours that underscored the monstrous cruelty of her killer. For the investigators and her family, the report was both a source of heartbreak and a critical piece of the puzzle for justice. The medical examiner determined that Julie's cause of death was exsanguination, a term for massive blood loss. It resulted from the 3 deep cuts to her throat. These wounds were not random. One cut severed her carotid artery, ensuring she would not survive long after the attack. Defensive wounds covered her hands, forearms, and shoulders. She had likely used her arms to shield her face and throat. The lashes crisscrossed her skin, evidence of her desperate attempt to fend off the attacker. Her right arm had been nearly severed, an injury that horrified the detectives when they saw it. The cut was so deep, it had almost detached her forearm from the rest of her body. Julie's left wrist was tightly bound with that intricate knot. It was complex and meticulous. The medical examiner noted that the knot wasn't improvised in the moment. It was the work of someone with experience tying knots. Possibly someone in the military, a scout, or someone with outdoor skills. This detail pointed to a calculated attack, rather than one carried out impulsively. The binding left deep indentations and bruising on Julie's wrist, indicating she had been restrained for an extended period. There were also ligature marks around her ankles, though no bindings were found at the scene. This suggested that the killer had tied her up during the attack, only to remove the restraints later, possibly to avoid leaving evidence behind. The autopsy also revealed clear evidence of a forced sexual act. The bruising and tearing were consistent with that, and male biological material was recovered from her body. The medical examiner preserved this material carefully. Although DNA testing in 1984 was still in its infancy, investigators knew it was a critical piece of evidence. At the time, they could only use the sample to determine things like blood type, but they preserved it in case technology advanced, just in case they found a suspect later and could match it. For Julie's family, the autopsy findings were devastating. The raw details of her injuries, clinical and detached on paper, brought an unbearable sense of what Julie had endured. Kathy Connell later said she couldn't stop imagining her daughter's final moments, the pain she must have felt, and her fight to survive. For Jim, the discovery of the bindings on Julie's wrists left him haunted by the thought of her being helpless, completely at the mercy of this monster. The brutality of the attack indicated that the killer was not a novice. Detectives couldn't shake the suspicion that whoever had done this to Julie might have done it before and would probably do it again. The community was haunted by that fear. The fallout from Julie's murder rippled through San Leandro. For a place that had always felt safe, with white picket fences, neighborhood cookouts, and that classic Main Street USA vibe, this kind of violence was almost unthinkable. Parents clutched their kids tighter, gripped by paranoia. Kennedy Park, once a place for laughter and picnics, was now a reminder of what had been lost. Some parents even stopped letting their kids play outside altogether. Others warned their teens to never, ever go anywhere alone. Julie's murder wasn't just a tragedy, it was also a wake-up call that this could happen to anyone. To be safe, to be aware. The investigators left Castro Valley with more questions than answers. Who had brought Julie to this isolated corral? How had they overpowered her in broad daylight, in a public park? And most importantly, who had done something so cruel? Julie's body might have been evidence of a horrific final chapter, but it wasn't the end of her story. For her family and the police, it was a fight for justice, and it had only just started. Now it's hard to imagine, but in the 1980s, investigations were painfully slow by today's standards. There was no Google, no DNA databases, no way to ping someone's phone, because they didn't even have a phone. So no one could even tell where your last location was. Everything relied on witnesses, physical evidence, and honestly, a bit of luck. And if a case didn't get solved within the first few weeks, it slipped into what we now call cold case territory, a file that would just gather dust in the corner of a precinct. One of the earliest challenges in this case came from the location where Julie had disappeared from, and then where she was discovered. Kennedy Park, where Julie was last seen, fell under the jurisdiction of the Hayward Police Department. However, the canyon in Castro Valley where her body was found was under the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. So this split jurisdiction caused confusion and delay, and authorities would debate who should take the lead. Detectives from both agencies worked the case at the same time, but then there were so many disconnections between these departments that it slowed the communication and information sharing. So it was just very discombobulated. The Connell family was painfully aware of all this bureaucratic delay from the very beginning, because the words of one Hayward police sergeant haunted them from way back when Julie had first vanished. He said, "We simply can't stop everything because one person is missing. We just don't have the resources." For Julie's parents, those words felt like a dismissal of their daughter's life. Everyone's life is important, even one person. They believed that precious time was lost during the critical first days that Julie had disappeared. As this investigation dragged on, the parents' frustration only grew. Eventually, it was decided that the Hayward Police Department would take control of Julie's case, and their first question: how had Julie been abducted from Kennedy Park without anyone noticing? That question led them back to where Julie had last been seen. Detectives tried to retrace her last steps. They combed through the area near the spot where she had spread out on her blanket, hoping to find a clue that everyone had missed. Unfortunately, time had passed since she disappeared, and the park was a high-traffic area. Any forensic evidence that might have been left behind was long gone. Still, the investigators pushed forward. They canvassed the entire area for witnesses. Julie's sister Wendy, the last person to see her, said she left around 1:50, and she described Julie sitting calmly with her book, surrounded by families enjoying the sunshine that day. Wendy had left the park to see a movie with friends, and when she said goodbye, she crossed the street to the festival cinema. When she returned, her sister was gone. Other people confirmed seeing Julie that afternoon, but no one reported hearing a scream or witnessing anything they thought was suspicious. With the investigation stalling, detectives decided to try something unconventional: a reenactment of Julie's last known moments. They convinced the local media to record it and cover it, to put it out to the public. They believed that staging her visit to Kennedy Park could possibly jog someone's memory and produce a breakthrough that they desperately needed. Now, what was really interesting was that Wendy agreed to step into her sister's shoes. Literally. She wore the same lavender shirt and blue jeans that Julie had been wearing the day that she disappeared and was killed. She sat in the same spot that Julie had, spreading out on her blanket. The reenactment drew a lot of media attention, of course. I mean, nothing like this was really happening back then, but there were tons of cameras capturing Wendy's quiet bravery as she sat there, mimicking her sister's final moments. However, Jim and Kathy were concerned. They knew that Wendy's participation could play a crucial role in unraveling the truth. While they understood the potential risks, they believed that Wendy's involvement could bring justice to their daughter. The detectives working on Julie's case admitted that they got the idea for this reenactment of her last sighting at Kennedy Park from San Francisco police because they used a similar method in their investigation of a 10-year-old boy, Kevin Collins, who disappeared on February 10th, 1984, and was still missing. And he still is today. Kathy Connell attended this reenactment, and when the media approached her and asked why she was there, she replied, "It's my daughter who got killed. I'm home. I've got a lot of time on my hands." That made me really sad that they didn't even know she was the mother of the victim and then actually asked her why she was sitting there. It was also sad that she had so much time on her hands and thought that it would be right to use it to be a part of this. The reenactment of Julie's last sighting in Kennedy Park proved to be instrumental in solving her case because the call came in to detectives. It was an employee of a store called Mervyn's, a department store nearby. They informed them that the company had been having an Easter party in the park for employees' families on the day that Julie went missing. This lead prompted detectives to interview everyone who attended the Mervyn's event. They were hoping to uncover any suspicious behavior or gather information about someone who might have seen Julie's abduction. Now, the closest thing that came to a lead from this was one of the employees from Mervyn's, who remembered seeing Julie near the mini-train ride that circled the park. According to a statement, he rode that train, which lasted only a few minutes, and when it returned, Julie was no longer there. So he saw her when he got on the train, but by the time the train circled back, she was no longer on her blanket, and everything was gone. Now, another lead was that the detectives were able to gather up photographs taken from this event in the park. These photos depicted various events throughout that day, including the arrival of the staff of the park, the setup of the gathering, the barbecue, ice cream party, and even an Easter egg hunt. One of the pictures, taken around noon, focused on the area where Julie had been sitting, but unfortunately the detectives could not identify any potential clues. By now, forensics had completed an analysis on the fingerprints on the gate, and unfortunately, this wasn't a lead. They belonged to the ranchers who discovered Julie's body, and the muddy footprint that was on the rail also provided no immediate matches. This left detectives frustrated, without a solid suspect. While DNA technology in 1984 was very limited, the sample did allow forensic experts to establish some basic traits about the perpetrator, including his blood type and the fact that he had reddish blonde hair. Further analysis revealed that the scalpel wrapping, remember that? The one that was discovered at the corral, actually ended up belonging to a rancher who used it while he was out there one day. So, by now it looks like the investigators were at a dead end. What they had was the biological material, and it's taken and frozen, awaiting advanced technology or to be matched to a suspect at some point. They also had wound analysis, the pattern of the cuts. This suggested a sharp object was used, and they were trying to look for any weapons to compare it to. Then they also had that binding technique, an intricate knot that was documented in detail. So the investigators began exploring whether this could be connected to any other crimes. Meanwhile, they looked into whether Julie's murder might be connected to some unsolved homicides in their area. Just weeks earlier, 14-year-old Tina Fields was stabbed to death near her junior high school. In December of the previous year, 14-year-old Kelly Poppleton had been beaten and stabbed to death. Both cases had very chilling similarities to Julie, and detectives wondered if they were dealing with the same killer, maybe a serial killer. To explore this possibility, the Alameda County Sheriff's Department formed a task force to investigate the links between these murders. Detectives dug into every detail, from the locations of the crimes to the types of wounds inflicted on the victims. But despite their efforts, no solid connections emerged. It seemed that Julie's murder was an isolated act of violence, or at least no one could prove otherwise at this point. The lack of progress weighed heavily on Julie's family. Jim and Kathy Connell, who had been relentless in their search for answers, were beginning to feel the strain. The constant media appearances, the long nights replaying every detail of Julie's last day, the crushing weight of not knowing, was exhausting for Wendy and Patricia. Their sister's murder was a shadow that hung over every aspect of their lives. Wendy later admitted that playing in that reenactment was an honor, but it was also a burden. It kept her sister's memory alive, but it also forced her to relive the trauma. For Patricia, every memory of Julie felt like a punch to her chest. She couldn't look at her sister's books or hear her favorite songs without breaking down in tears. 1 month after Julie's murder, the Connell family began to receive very threatening phone calls at their house. These calls would come in very late at night, usually around 11 p.m., and they would taunt the entire family, but in particular, Julie's younger sisters, Wendy and Patricia. The caller would actually whisper very chilling words, things like, "I knew your sister, I'm going to do the exact same thing to you." It was disgusting, and the Connell family was terrified by these calls. Obviously, they sought assistance from the police to track the caller's identity. The police set up a trace on the phone line, and through their efforts, they actually traced the call to a specific person. However, to their disappointment and surprise, This person making the calls was just some prankster who thought this was funny. That's really sick humor. And even though they had malicious intent to scare and terrify the family, they had nothing to do with Julie's murder. I don't see why someone would do a twisted prank like this and try to distress the family further, but people do this stuff. The investigation itself had actually stalled, and as time passed, there were no answers. The Connell family became even more frustrated. They started to think they would never uncover their daughter's killer. The days actually turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months, and years went by without finding the perpetrator. One detective informed the Connell family that they may never know the identity of the person that killed their daughter. This detective warned them not to be surprised if the case remained unsolved. But we're here today talking about it, so you already know they found the killer. Julie's room became a shrine to her memory. It was left exactly the way it was before she disappeared. Her books, her trinkets, even her purse was still in there, containing the money that she had carefully saved. It was all left untouched. It served as a painful reminder of the life she had left behind. The community's initial outpouring of support gradually faded as the years passed, but for the Connell family, the wounds still remained raw. They refused to let Julie's case just fade into nothing, and they continued to fight for justice, even as the trail grew cold. Over a decade went by, which I can't even imagine, all of that time passing. The leads fizzled out, potential suspects came and went, and investigators were left with nothing but unanswered questions. By the late 1990s, it really seemed like Julie's case would join countless other cold cases, just filed away and forgotten. But what Julie's family didn't know at that point, what no one knew, was that science was quietly catching up to her killer. The DNA evidence collected from Julie's autopsy, once little more than a footnote in the case file, was about to become the key to unlocking the mystery that haunted them for years. So let's fast forward to when technology made leaps and bounds. The creation of the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, allowed law enforcement to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes against a national database of offenders. Suddenly, cases that had been ice cold for many years started to thaw. 14 years after the murder of Julie Connell, the district attorney's office decided to reopen her case, and they sent the DNA evidence collected from her body for analysis. This process is slow, meticulous, and the sample was fragile after years in storage. It had to be carefully prepared to avoid contamination or degradation. However, District Attorney Angela Backers discovered that the DNA collected from Julie's body in 1984 was no longer even compatible with the newly established CODIS database. This was really disappointing, but she was determined to uncover the identity of Julie's killer, and this was all she had. She got some assistance from a friend who was a renowned forensic scientist, and he had this ingenious system that was able to cross-check older DNA profiles. Knowing that time was of the essence, Angela read the DNA profile over the phone, hoping that the scientists could uncover any promising leads. After weeks of waiting, the results came back. Surprisingly, there was a match. The DNA belonged to a convicted murderer who was already sitting on California's death row. His name was Robert Boyd Rhodes. Robert was never an initial suspect in Julie's murder. He was never even on their radar. They hadn't even heard his name before, but Robert Rhodes had an extensive criminal history. So they were right about one thing. He had done this before. And if the name Robert Boyd Rhodes doesn't send a chill down your spine, it will, after you hear this. By the time his DNA was linked to Julie's case, Robert was already infamous for another brutal crime. In 1996, he kidnapped, tortured, and killed an 8-year-old little boy named Michael Lyons in Yuba City, California. A crime that was so horrifying it made national headlines. 8-year-old Michael Lyons was just walking home from school when he vanished. He lived with his mother, Sandra Friend, and stepfather, and had 2 younger sisters. The family lived in an apartment about a mile from Bridge Street School, and Sandra was a stay-at-home mother, while Michael's stepfather worked as a painter. They were very hard-working people, and Michael was the type of kid who made friends easily. He would stay after class to help his teachers, make jokes to brighten someone's day, and even brought flowers to a girl that he liked. One neighbor of Michael's later told the FBI he had witnessed the boy walking home from school. The neighbor said he saw Michael playing in the park between Yuba Sutter Fairgrounds and Michael's apartment complex. This witness added that he had seen a man drive up next to Michael and start talking to him. According to the neighbor, the man grabbed Michael and pulled him into his truck. Now initially, and this surprised me, the witness was not alarmed by this because he said Michael didn't appear to resist the man. I'm thinking this is an 8-year-old little boy. How is he supposed to resist this person who grabbed him and threw him into a truck? But somehow, this witness assumed that the child knew this person. Less than 24 hours after 8-year-old Michael Lyons was abducted, his body was discovered at 10:52. Amid dense brush along Feather River, less than 2.5 miles from the school that he went to. It was clear to the detectives working on his case that he had been murdered. Sadly, they found 70 to 80 shallow knife marks on Michael's body, made with a fisherman-style fillet knife. The way these wounds were inflicted indicated that this poor boy was tortured and kept alive for hours as he endured unspeakable pain. However, the cause of death was determined to be a stab wound to his neck and back, severing his spinal cord. He clutched onto his silver bracelet in his hand, a heartbreaking detail that hinted at the small comfort he clung to in his final moments. Detectives also discovered indications that Michael had been violated prior to his murder. He was found nude from the waist down with a dark green sweater pulled up over his head. Between Michael's body and the river, which was 10 to 15 feet away, was a blood-stained blanket. Robert Rhodes was discovered by the police when his truck got stuck in the mud about a half-mile from the location where Michael Lyons' body had been found. When Robert was found, he was sitting motionless in his driver's seat, wearing wet blue jeans and was completely shirtless and barefoot. His demeanor was eerily calm, but his presence there was suspicious. Upon further examination, the police noted a cable attached to a winch, which was wrapped around the truck's rear axle and secured to a tree. On the open tailgate was a fishing knife, a thin-bladed fillet knife with a serrated edge. The knife had blood and river soil in the corners where the blade met the handle, and DNA testing later showed that the blood on the handle crevices was Michael's, which was intended to provide the community with a way of safeguarding themselves against monsters like this. I think somehow, back in that day, that wasn't really an efficient way of documenting and putting it out to the public who they should be aware of in their community. Now, I think it might be easier because we have the internet and you can clearly just look it up, but that's the way they did it back then. For Michael's family, this loss altered their lives. Sandra Friend, Michael's mother, described her son as the heart of their home. He was just a happy 8-year-old kid who liked playing shortstop on his baseball team. Losing him in such a violent, senseless way shattered her entire world. Sandra later recounted how she would sit by herself for hours, thinking about the 10 hours of torture Michael endured. She couldn't stop imagining her son's pain, how scared he must have been, and the evil he faced in his final moments. She said, "It took me many, many years to come to terms with what happened to Michael. There's so much hurt, anger, and despair when someone takes your child. Your whole being is ripped out, and you have to rebuild it very, very slowly." The emotional devastation did not stop with Sandra. Her husband, Michael's stepfather, turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism, and her daughters, Michael's sisters, struggled to make sense of his loss. Michael's younger sister, Althea, only 5 years old at the time, later shared how deeply it impacted her entire childhood. She described waiting for her sister on their apartment steps, wrapped in his Spider-Man blanket, not knowing if she would ever come home. Once she became an adult, she recalled how the murder turned her family's world upside down. She said, "Each one of my family members died that day in their very own way. I'm 25 years old and I'm still afraid of the dark." The trauma shaped her entire life, just as it did for Sandra and the rest of their family. Michael's mother's grief could have consumed her, but instead, she found the strength in fighting for change. She threw herself into advocacy work, channeling her pain into efforts to protect other families from enduring the same nightmare. She became an outspoken supporter of laws targeting offenders, including California Megan's Law, which allows the public to access information about registered offenders in their communities. Sandra worked tirelessly to educate parents about the tools to keep their children safe. She often spoke at schools, warning children about the dangers of strangers and empowering them to recognize unsafe situations. Her advocacy extended beyond her local community. She testified before lawmakers, participated in rallies, and even collaborated with other parents who had lost children to violent crimes. In memory of her son Michael, Sandra established the Michael Lyons Foundation, which is dedicated to raising awareness about crimes against children and supporting families of victims. But this was all after Robert had already committed a number of crimes and was now linked to Julie's murder. He had once robbed a woman at a store right near the park where Julie disappeared, and later forged 2 checks from the woman's bank account. Back in 1985, only 1 year after Julie Connell's murder, Robert attacked another woman in Yuba County. He gained entry to her home, held her at gunpoint, and threatened her life if she didn't give him her money. Then, he handcuffed her to a chair, violated her, and after he was finished, his words were chilling. He said, "This is like Bonnie and Clyde, but Bonnie is not going to make it." He put her into his truck and drove towards the river. This woman, in a desperate act of survival, managed to jump from the moving vehicle, and Robert then reversed the truck towards her, trying to hit her. But she managed to roll underneath. She recognized her opportunity to flee and ran to a nearby building. Robert was then arrested and convicted of kidnapping and a forced sex act, but he wasn't locked up for long. Once he was released, he went right back to his old ways. In 1993, he violated a 4-year-old, a granddaughter of the woman he was dating at the time. This crime resulted in yet another conviction for lewd acts against a child, cementing his status as a predator who preyed on the vulnerable. But despite these convictions, and this always seemed to happen, especially in older cases, Robert remained free for most of his life, just quietly moving through California like a shadow. Robert was convicted of Michael's murder and finally sentenced to death in 1999, and by 2002, his DNA was matched to Julie's case. The brutal similarities between her murder and Michael's painted a very terrifying picture of who Robert was. He was cold, calculating, and a killer who derived pleasure from inflicting great pain. He wasn't just a murderer, he was also a predator, and he thrived on controlling and destroying people's lives. He didn't care about gender. If a vulnerable person was his target, they were fair game. But investigators wondered, would the similarities be enough to convict him? The district attorney wasn't sure they'd be able to secure a conviction against Robert, who would have been 31 at the time he killed Julie, just based on the DNA evidence alone. Now you're thinking, DNA evidence is a surefire sign that he did this. Well, not exactly. Because you probably realize that the defense is going to insist that sure, there might have been a sexual encounter, but it was consensual. And of course, that's what they plan to argue in this case. So the investigators knew they had to find something else connecting this man to Julie's murder. And this was so many years later. They were racking their brains, trying to figure out what other evidence and clues they could look for. And there was no one more invested in this case than the district attorney, Angela Backers. She was relentless. She scoured the evidence piece by piece, not even sleeping, and spent every waking hour trying to find a connection. Finally, she was able to locate one of Robert's ex-girlfriends who he was dating back in 1984. And that ex-girlfriend revealed 2 very important details. 1, he had been living less than a block away from Kennedy Park, where Julie had been last seen. And 2, he drove a green truck at the time. Now the green truck gave Angela an idea. What if he had driven that same green truck that day and parked it somewhere at Kennedy Park, where he took Julie? She remembered all of those pictures that were collected from the employees of Mervyn's department store, who had that party that day at the park. She looked at each and every one of them, trying to see if she could spot a vehicle that matched the description of the green truck. Angela said that she was so fed up And so many detectives had already looked through all these photographs time and time again for so many years with nothing. So she actually prayed, but she prayed to Julie. She was like, please, please give me something to go on, please. Then she grabbed a magnifying glass and she went corner to corner, up and down. She couldn't believe it. In a somewhat blurry photo, an old, bad quality photograph, there it was, a green truck. Then she scanned down from the truck and she couldn't believe it. There was Julie on the blanket. Now it's very hard to make out the details, but the colors tell a story. The blanket, her shirt, it was her, and the truck, it was there at the same time. This proved it. It was the link that they needed. All of the evidence combined provided the district attorney with sufficient evidence to charge Robert Rhodes with the murder of Julie Connell. Now, the weight of the past was heavy for Julie's family. The news that Robert had been identified as her killer, of course, brought a mixture of relief, but also heartbreak. The revelation that this man had gone on to murder Michael Lyons and potentially harmed others in the years between when Julie disappeared and when he was found was devastating. Julie's sisters, Wendy and Patricia, were now adults, and each of them were grappling with their own memories of their sister that they lost. Kathy Connell reflected on the long years of just waiting and waiting. She said, "You hold on to the hope for so long, but when the truth finally comes, it's so much worse than you imagined." And in 2007, 23 years after Julie's murder, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office prepared to take Robert to trial. Now by this time, he was already on death row for Michael Lyons' murder, but prosecutors were determined to hold him accountable for Julie's murder as well. And I really respected that, because I've seen cases where this is not done because the person is already serving a death or life sentence. But in this case, they went forward. The prosecution's theory was that after Julie was done studying, she began to pack up all of her belongings into her backpack, her blanket, her book, and other items, and was possibly going to walk home, which was not too far away from the park. No one can know for sure what happened next, but they think that Robert either somehow convinced Julie to get close enough to his truck to snag her and throw her inside. Maybe he asked her a simple question, or maybe he was just fast enough to grab her after watching her for some time as she sat on the blanket in the park. It doesn't matter how he kidnapped her, because once he did, he forced himself on her. Then, he brought her out to the corral and took her life. The defense wasted no time crafting a counter-narrative. Knowing that the DNA evidence would be central to the prosecution's case, they of course argued that 31-year-old Robert and Julie, only 18, had been in a committed, consensual relationship. This claim shocked and angered Julie's family. She had a boyfriend at the time. She had just turned 18. There was no way that she was having any kind of relations with this 31-year-old murderer. Robert's sister, though, even testified, claiming that she saw the two together, and she described them as a couple. I don't know why a family member would have the audacity to essentially get on the stand and lie for their family member, who's already committed a heinous crime, but to each their own. The defense also attempted to highlight the passage of time, suggesting that the decades between Julie's murder and the trial would muddy the evidence, but the prosecution countered by showing how carefully this DNA sample had been preserved and how the advancements of technology had finally allowed justice to be served. For prosecutors, the defense claims were not only absurd, but they were deeply insulting to Julie's memory. They worked tirelessly to dismantle this narrative, highlighting Julie's character, her aspirations, and the lack of any evidence supporting the defense's version of events. This trial was obviously grueling for Julie's family. They were forced to relive every detail of her brutal murder, but they listened as prosecutors described the DNA evidence that linked Robert to Julie and the striking similarities between her case and his other crimes. A key moment came when the prosecution played video of Julie performing on stage, showing her vibrant personality and the bright future that she had ahead of her. For the jurors, it was a stark reminder of the life that was stolen from her and the magnitude of this crime. The jury also saw the photographic evidence that placed Robert's green truck at Kennedy Park on the day that Julie disappeared. It was a critical piece of this puzzle that tied him to the scene of the crime and reinforced the timeline of events. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated in less than an hour before delivering their verdict. Robert Boy Rods was guilty of the murder of Julie Connell, and her family wept as the decision was read. For them, it was a moment of profound relief and vindication. Her dad said, "We waited so long for this. It doesn't bring her back, but at least we know he can't hurt anyone else." One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Julie's parents delivered their impact statements. Jim stood before the court, his voice steady, but it was also filled with emotion. He was determined to talk for his daughter. He described her as bright and ambitious and spoke about her love for books, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the hole her death had left in their family. He said, "We've spent every day since April 19th, 1984, wondering what Julie's life could have been like. Would she have gotten married, had children, made a difference in the world? We'll never know, because Robert Rods took all of that away." Kathy Connell followed him, describing the pain of losing Julie as a weight that she carried every day. She said, "No parent should have to bury their child, and no family should have to wait nearly 20 years for justice." Wendy and Patty also spoke, and they shared their memories of their sister and how her murder had shaped their entire lives. Patricia, who was just 12 at the time, told the jury how she struggled with fear and anxiety growing up, always wondering if the same thing was going to happen to her. The jury eventually recommended the death penalty, making Robert Rods one of the few individuals in California to receive multiple death sentences. The judge upheld this recommendation, sentencing Robert Rods to death for Julie's murder. As the family left the courtroom, Kathy reflected, saying, "This will not bring her back, but now she can rest. We can rest." For the Connell family, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not the end of their grief. Jim and Kathy continued to advocate for victims' rights, sharing Julie's story in the hope that it would inspire other families to keep fighting for justice. Wendy and Patty carried their sister's memory with them into adulthood, determined to honor the life that she could have lived. The San Leandro community also found some peace in this outcome. Kennedy Park, which was once a place of joy, had turned to sorrow, but then it became a symbol of resilience. A small memorial bench was placed there in Julie's honor. It was a reminder that she was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, and a bright light that was extinguished too soon. Julie Connell's story is one that will linger after the trial ends, not just because of the horrifying nature of her murder, but because of the resilience, the determination, and the love that her family showed in the face of an unimaginable loss. It's a story that reminds us of the fragility of life, the importance of vigilance, and the power of never giving up. For the Connell family, justice did not come easily or quickly. It came after nearly 2 decades of heartbreak and unanswered questions. Their persistence, their refusal to let Julie's case be forgotten, and their willingness to fight for her memory are powerful lessons of courage and hope. But there's another takeaway, one that speaks to all of us: the importance of community. In the aftermath of Julie's disappearance, her family leaned on friends, neighbors, and even strangers who helped them. They helped to pass out flyers, they joined search parties, and they shared her story. And the same was true for SRA Friend and her fight to honor her son, Michael Lyons. This shows us that when things like this happen, it's really important for collective action to be taken, and it can make a major difference in cases like this. Now, more so than ever, social media can be a good thing, even if some people see it as a bad thing. Having a community to be searching, even creating websites, and passing information along on things like Facebook, that's how cases like Gabby Petito's ended up being solved. And of course, we have a lot more technology. We have cameras everywhere, people taking photos and using their devices, so they're bound to capture something. Julie's story also shows the need for advancements in technology and the role that they play in justice. DNA technology, which didn't even exist in 1984, became the turning point in solving Julie's case, and it's a reminder of how science, when paired with persistence, can uncover truths that time alone cannot erase. They say to go after what you want in life: romance, happiness, love, wealth. But sometimes, chasing our dreams leads to our worst nightmares, deadly. I want to introduce you to Julie Nist, but before I do, I'd like to introduce you to her parents, Julia and John. Julie's mother's name is Julia Bowman. She was born just a couple of days before Valentine's Day, on February 12, 1943, in Twin Lakes, which is an Indian reservation in New Mexico. She's part of the American Indian Navajo tribe, which is the second largest Indian nation in the United States. Back when Julia's mom was growing up, life on her reservation was not easy. There was a lack of electricity and running water, and not much to do, which led a lot of individuals down a path of alcohol and drug addiction to escape their everyday life. When Julia was 12, her parents decided to send her away. She went to a boarding school because they wanted her to learn English. This was located in Brigham City, Utah. When she got to the school, Julia started to realize that she didn't even know what the world was like beyond the reservation. Now, she was free. Julia was a beautiful girl. She had dark, long hair and gorgeous almond-shaped eyes. She had also been very confident and independent. As she spent more time away from her family and away from the reservation, the more she decided she didn't want to go back. It would be a couple more years before Julia was brave enough to tell her parents how she was feeling and that she wouldn't be coming back. However, instead of abandoning her education, she decided to just transfer to another Indian American school in Nevada. She loved it, and when she was 16, she started working as a nanny, which opened up her world even more. The family she worked for would take trips, and she would accompany them so that she could help with their children. One summer, she actually went to San Francisco, and while she was there, she was introduced to big city life. She'd never seen anything like it before. The traffic, the people, the noises of a city, the big skyscrapers. Everything was brand new, and it opened up this door of so many more possibilities she wanted to explore. So she decided to move to Colorado Springs. As soon as Julia moved to Colorado Springs, she started working as a nurse's aide. This was at a facility for the mentally ill. Julia was perfect for this job. She was very friendly, she liked to socialize, and Colorado Springs itself was perfect because they had an active nightlife, and she would be going out with friends all the time. There was a problem, though. There was something that nobody knew about Julia. She had some demons. While she was working at the hospital, one of her co-workers, who was also a close friend, introduced her to amphetamines. The co-worker seemed to always be alert, pulling double shifts, picking up extra work, yet still finding time to have the energy to party all night. Julia was curious about how in the world she was able to do that. She got up the nerve to ask, and her friend said she had the secret. She had been stealing pills from the hospital. Speed pills. You want to try? Of course, Julia was naive, so she said yes. This would be the beginning of a long, bumpy road of addiction. Maybe if she could have seen her future before deciding to swallow that first pill, Julia would have made a totally different decision. If only she knew. As they say, hindsight is 20/20ths. She really enjoyed speed, mostly because it allowed her to stay up for days at a time. This seems like a good thing to some, but it wasn't. Even though she was awake, she was experiencing a lot of irritability. She was slowly becoming less of herself. She wasn't the Julia everyone used to know. It's usually a slow decline. It's not noticeable at first. Not only was she doing amphetamines, but she also became a heavy drinker. I'm highlighting this because of what happens in the future. Julia loved the nightlife because she got a lot of attention. She looked different from everybody else. She was the only Navajo girl. This made her extremely popular in her town. One night, on July 4th, 1964, while she was partying at a pub with friends, she bumped into a tall, handsome military police officer named John Scully. John was stationed at Fort Carson. He was 25 years old, grew up in Philadelphia, and was very different from Julia. John looked in her direction, and he noticed right away her beautiful dark hair, olive skin, just an exotic beauty, and he made his way over to her to start a conversation. They really didn't have that much in common except for the physical attraction that both of them felt instantly. John was smitten. He asked her out right away, and she said yes. So, They went on their first date, and they hit it off. After only a few more dates, John proposed to Julia. He said the minute he saw her, he knew that he was going to marry her. It sounds like a fairy tale right now. Anyway, on July 2nd, 1965, 2 days before the one-year anniversary of the day they met for the first time, Julia and John were married. They had a small ceremony at a Catholic church in Colorado Springs. However, they soon realized they couldn't afford where they were living, so they moved back to Philadelphia, closer to John's family. This is also when John applied to the Philadelphia Police Department. On February 6th, 1966, he officially started working as a patrol officer in North Philadelphia, a neighborhood well known for being dangerous. As you can imagine, this was hard on Julia. She was constantly worried, and it wasn't like today. They didn't have cell phones or any mode of communication that was readily available to keep in touch. There were times when he had to rush out in the middle of his day off because he was on call and there was an emergency. But in the spring of 1967, Julia found out she was pregnant. Right away, she imagined this would change her life and put it in a new direction because she would have something to focus on at home while John was working. Julia gave birth to Julie Marie Scully on January 3rd, 1968. By the way, I will say that as the story goes on, we're going to be saying the names Julia and Julie a lot. I definitely try to keep it straight, but just know it is very hard and confusing when people have such similar names. Now they were a family. John started taking his family on fishing trips, which was a pastime he had enjoyed with his own family. As Julie grew up, she and her father built a really strong bond, and she became a very adventurous little girl who adored nature. They spent most of their time exploring the countryside and fishing in the lake. Another activity they would do, which became a tradition in their family, was crabbing. This was one of the activities that helped build their strong bond. However, one reason Julie might have enjoyed it so much was because she was constantly looking for approval and praise from her father. This will be a thread that carries through the story. Julia, however, wasn't thrilled about these vacations after a while because she felt like a third wheel. She was bored, left out, and sitting in the trailer while they bonded over fishing. She just wanted to go home. It was also hard on her because she was hiding a secret from her family. They didn't know about her addiction. Now, as she was getting older, it was finally starting to catch up with her. She became unpredictable and temperamental. She had been seeing several doctors, and each one of them had tried their best to wean her off amphetamines, but it just wouldn't work. Sooner or later, she fell into a very deep depression and ended up trading one drug for another. She started using heroin. Despite her struggles, Julia gave birth to another child, a son named John Patrick Scully, born on November 10th, 1969. Now it was Julie's turn to find out what it felt like to be left out, because it turned out John spent most of his time with John Jr. and not Julie. This made Julie ramp up her efforts to seek love and attention from her dad. However, John was working more than ever and hardly coming home. Even on Christmas, he had to leave. Julia was feeling abandoned. She was alone, taking care of 2 children, and she felt like she was a single mother. Then something terrible happened. Julia wasn't paying close attention to Julie, who was playing outside in the front yard when she walked into the street and was struck by a motorcyclist. It was serious. Julie was rushed to the hospital, and there was more bad news. She had suffered major internal injuries and had to undergo emergency surgery, which included the removal of her spleen. Julia, however, was worried about something else. The doctors were injecting Julie with morphine to help with the pain, and Julie seemed to be enjoying it. Julia was terrified that this might be the first step toward a life of addiction for her daughter. Another tragedy struck in 1973. Julia had been making efforts to stop using speed, but the withdrawals were too much for her. Every time she tried to wean herself off, she fell into another deep depression. She felt so alone, hiding her struggles from her family. She could hardly sleep, which made her life harder because she was taking care of the kids while completely exhausted, irritable, and angry with a very short fuse. This mental downward spiral led Julia to take an entire bottle of sleeping pills. When John got home, the kids were in bed, and he found Julia unconscious. No one expects this to happen. You cannot prepare for it. However, John was used to being in high-stress situations, so he quickly sprang into action, saving her life. She was rushed to the hospital, and they were able to pump her stomach in time. Even though Julie was young, she was still witnessing all of this. She was being brought up by a mother who was not stable. As Julie got older, it became more and more apparent that her mother was struggling. It was a constant battle, and the downward spiral did not stop for Julia. Her family now knew her secret, and there were more and more outward signs of drug abuse. Julia began gaining excess weight, and she didn't look like herself anymore. This only made her fall back into an even deeper depression. It wasn't long before she tried to take her life again, and just like before, with the exact same outcome, she was saved in time. Both of the children desperately wanted someone to pay them attention, but Julie was impacted the most. She felt unwanted and second best, no matter what her parents had going on in their lives. In fact, in 1976, on Julie's 9th birthday, her parents would prove that they cared more about their own needs and struggles than about what their child was feeling on such a special day. They had friends and family over, and Julie's whole world came crashing down. John was having an affair. During Julie's birthday party, he told everyone that he had to leave. Whether it was for work or to meet friends, I don't know, but Julia was suspicious. John had been confiding in others that it was really hard being with Julia. He had lost interest because of her drug abuse. She wasn't the woman he fell in love with, especially when it came to her appearance. It might sound superficial, but the drugs had taken a toll on her body. She had lost her beautiful physique due to the excess drinking, and it was hard for John because he had loved her so much. But from the beginning, it had been that physical attraction that drew them together, and now it had faded away, along with John's loyalty. The only thing holding their marriage together was their kids. John had been looking for a way out, and he found it. He said that every time he came home, Julia was completely wasted, and you couldn't even talk to her about it, not to mention the 2 times he had to save her when she took the sleeping pills. He felt that he had done all he could. None of this excuses cheating, but if he was looking for a way out, I guess he found it. Some people want to be caught, and maybe John was one of those people. John walked out the door at the party, and Julia walked out right behind him. As she looked outside, she saw John's mistress, and not only that, she saw them kissing. Julia was already in such a bad place in her life, and I can only imagine how much worse that moment felt. John was doing this in public, and he wasn't worried about it. That's why it seemed to me like he wanted to be caught. It wasn't long before John completely left the family, and they were all devastated. Of course, this didn't help Julia's situation. She started sinking further and further into depression, drinking more and more. Then she began taking her sadness and anger out on the children. She continuously tried to turn them against their father. She wanted them to believe that John left because of them, that he didn't love them anymore. This deeply hurt Julie, as she adored her father. She missed him terribly and was worried that maybe she would never be close to him again. So this started a rebellion. Julie had always been a really good student, but her grades started to slip, and of course her father was very upset. He decided to switch her to a private school called Holy Name in Kensington, hoping that with more rules and structure, she would do better. She definitely wasn't getting that at home, so maybe if she got it in school, her grades would improve, and they did. Julie started hanging out with a better crowd, and for a while, she was doing much better. However, it didn't last long. Julie was very popular and soon she started skipping school. At this point, she was about to become a teenager, 12 years old and gorgeous. She was tall, had long, shiny black hair, perfect skin, a big, pretty smile, and even from a young age, her beauty and charisma were traits that others admired most. Just like her mom, Julie stood out in a crowd, in a good way. She knew she was pretty, and boys were always trying to get her attention. She was also boy crazy, which is typical for girls her age, but for Julie, boys were far more interesting than school. Skipping school eventually turned into staying out late, very late, into the night. Her parents were worried, especially because they lived in a rough area. Julia was scared that Julie would be introduced to drugs. For example, Julie once planned to have a sleepover, but when Julia came in to check on the girls, they were gone. Julia panicked, as any parent would, and called 911. The police eventually found the girls in downtown Philadelphia, which must have been terrifying for Julia. Julie did things like this because she had no respect for her mother, and the arguments between them kept escalating. It became a cycle of arguing, running away, and the police picking her up. Julie's dad was absent, too busy with work to really care, and nothing was getting resolved. Finally, Julie couldn't handle it anymore and asked to move in with her dad. At the time, John was living with his girlfriend, Loralee. They had a nice house, and neither of them was used to having kids around. When Julie moved in, they sat her down and explained the house rules and what they expected if she was going to live there. Julie had a curfew on weeknights, and John, being a cop, wanted to know where she was at all times. This meant Julie couldn't hide much from him, and like most teenagers, she butted heads with adults, particularly John's girlfriend, Loralee. Julie didn't want to listen. She had never really had a mother figure in her life or any real structure, so she rebelled against it every chance she got. Every time Loralee tried to get Julie to do something, it turned into a big argument. John thought that Julia had influenced their kids this way, and he blamed her for Julie's rebellious behavior, even though many teenagers act out regardless. Determined to gain more control over the situation, John decided to fight for full custody, and he won. Once Julie was living with him full-time, John thought it would be best to put her into therapy to help curb her bad behavior. Julie met with a psychiatrist to talk about her life and her childhood, which she described as pretty awful. Now, we can't compare her experiences with ours or others, because that would invalidate her personal feelings. This was the only life Julie knew, and in her perspective, it was harsh, and that's valid. In 1982, Julie finished middle school at Holy Name. Her father was now concerned about where she would go for high school, as he only wanted the best education for her. Being a police officer, John was used to receiving special treatment in the community, so he figured, why not try to use his status to help with Julie's education? This wasn't something Julie wanted. It was all John's idea. There was a prestigious high school in the area, called the High School of Engineering and Science, which opened in 1979. It offered a pathway to transfer to Temple University, and the high school itself was located on the Temple University campus. Students could even take college courses as part of their high school program. However, the school was very selective. Only a couple of hundred students were accepted into 9th grade each year, and applicants had to go through a rigorous process, including an entrance exam. Determined to get Julie into the school, John put on his full police uniform and went to speak with the principal. While we don't know exactly what that conversation entailed, it's clear that John tried to persuade the school to accept Julie. He also requested that she be classified as a minority, given her Navajo heritage. In the fall of 1983, Julie was accepted and John was over the moon. He had ruthlessly pursued this opportunity for her, and he felt his hard work had finally paid off. Julie, wanting to please her father, was just as excited. But at the same time, she was juggling her desire to have fun with friends, hang out with boys, and be a serious student. You could have guessed, but partying was taking the lead. Friends said she was always partying and putting pleasure first over her schoolwork. She was skipping school all the time, mingling with college students and the popular crowd, who were always getting in trouble. It wasn't long until John got a call from the school to discuss Julie's attendance. Saying John was pissed was an understatement. He was livid, and he was super disappointed. He felt like he tried so hard to make this work, so of course they started getting into pretty big arguments. It's hard. Parents think they know best. As parents, we want our children to live the best life possible. We've been there, we've done that, and we don't want them to go through the same struggles. Sometimes they take things for granted, and then they can't go back in time. It's understandable. Julie is 14. She was still so young. But she boldly told her father that she wanted to withdraw from school. Cool, John thought. This was all out of spite because, in his mind, she was doing this to him because he cheated and left his family. The truth was, Julie felt second best to Lorelei, and she felt John chose his girlfriend over her. She didn't feel loved, and she was using partying as a way out of her sadness. She liked going to parties because, when she walked in, she was the center of attention. All eyes were on her. All of this attention-seeking behavior escalated once Julie was introduced to sex. This was just another tool in her arsenal that she could use to get attention from men. She began jumping from one boy to the next. She would have a long string of casual relationships. She would get into one, then get bored very easily, end it, and find another boy. From what her friends said, she always seemed to have a boyfriend, and she needed something or someone all the time. She never seemed to want to be alone. Her brother was on a completely different path. John Jr., coming from the exact same family and the same background, did not act out this way, and he ended up going into the Navy. By 1984, at 16 years old, she decided it was time to leave high school, and instead she got a job as an administrative assistant. She loved making her own money because she enjoyed buying clothes, jewelry, and makeup. Who doesn't? What girl doesn't like that? She was also living with friends, so she could do anything she wanted, and this seemed to work very well for her. She had everything she could possibly want, except a guy, and she found one. His name was Neil Ziegler. Neil was 6 years older than Julie. He was tall, handsome, and he came from a very wealthy family in Morristown, which is one of the most affluent communities in South Jersey. Not sure if this is going to be surprising or not, but Julie and Neil ended up getting married in November of 1985, just a couple of months before Julie was turning 18. She didn't even tell her dad. Being with Neil gave Julie financial and emotional stability, but she still felt like she was missing out on having fun despite being in love. When John did find out about the marriage, he was actually happy because he felt like it would keep Julie on a better path. John really liked the fact that Neil's dad was a doctor and a professor. As soon as things started to look better from John's perspective, Julie wanted out of the marriage, and he was just like, "It figures." Once again, he felt like she was doing this out of spite. The marriage was annulled in 1988. Julie had nowhere to go, so she was forced to live back with her mom. And at this point, she found a job at an insurance company, and it paid very well. Julie was somewhat selfish with her money, though, and she wasn't even helping pay Julia, even though she was living under her roof. As an adult, she continuously just spent her money on material things, and they began to fight. Julie moved out once again and moved into an apartment with friends. One thing was very apparent to everyone, including Julie. Everywhere she went, people, whether it was men or women, almost broke their necks to catch a glimpse of her when she walked by. She was always being asked if she was a model. She was tall, she was 5 feet 7 inches, and she had a perfect body, very proportional. People just thought she was stunning. Most importantly, she knew that she had a power over men, and she knew how to use it, and she loved using it. All that was on the outside was just Julie's shell. On the inside, she was very insecure, and she was desperately in search of love. She wanted that loyal devotion and affection, not just these casual dates, and she was determined to find a man who truly loved her and gave her exactly what she wanted. She felt like she was quite a catch and that she deserved it, and a man like this ended up finding her. Julie was used to being invited to lavish parties all the time, and on July 8, 1989, Julie was at a fancy yacht club party. She was enjoying herself, she was drinking, she was dancing with friends, and all the while there was a guy in the crowd that had his eyes on her, and his name was Tim Nist. Tim was captivated by Julie's beauty, and he was telling his friends, "I need to go over there and talk to her." It wasn't hard because Julie was very friendly, and Tim was clearly well off. She was impressed with him, he was dressed nicely, and then he asked her if she wanted to take a spin around town in his Porsche. Of course, she did not pass on that opportunity, and they ended up hanging out and talking all night. They wanted to see each other again. Tim invited her to the beach to go surfing, and they were pretty much taken with one another. Tim was responsible, he was financially stable, and he was 11 years older. That was a good thing because, like her dad said, she needed that structure to keep her on a good path. They did grow up in very opposite situations, though. Tim was the fourth child. He had three older sisters. They were a middle-class family. They lived near Princeton, New Jersey, and he really had no big problems growing up in a very close family. His stay-at-home mom and his dad owned a pesticides and fertilizer business. His family instilled very good habits, manners, and discipline in him. He studied engineering, dropped out of college, and then started his own car restoration company. Tim was a good-looking guy. He was tall, he's 6 feet 4 inches, with a great sense of humor. In the 1980s, he switched careers and opened up a landscaping company. This is when his career really started to blow up, and he started making a lot of money. The real estate market was at an all-time high, so people were buying homes, they were new homeowners, and they wanted manicured lawns. It made sense, and he was doing this work all out of his condo. He just had one employee, which was a secretary, helping him set up the appointments and managing his books and clients. As soon as Julie came into his life, she wasn't thrilled about that part, about him having a secretary. But Tim told her he wouldn't be able to run his business all on his own. I was wondering if you would call this jealousy, because, as an adult, I would assume Julie would be mature enough to realize it's just an employee. However, the people we spend the most time with have a better chance of being in a relationship with us or having a closer relationship. It happens all the time. Actors end up dating each other. You know, Tim also had a lot of other women in his life. He didn't seem like he was wanting to settle down anytime soon. If he had, he would have been married already because he had been engaged several times throughout his 20s. However, Tim was spending a lot more time with Julie than anyone else, and they both had a love for ice hockey, which made going out with each other a lot of fun. They had a routine. They would go to the Jersey Devils games together, and then go out and party all night. The age difference never seemed to be an issue, but what was an issue was Julie's insecurity because her father cheated. This was always a concern. Tim, on the other hand, was not jealous, but Tim was not her boyfriend yet. Julie was putting pressure on Tim. Tim knew if he lost her, he'd probably have a hard time finding someone like her again, so he didn't want to let her go. She was so gorgeous, she had a good sense of humor, and she was friendly. He couldn't help but say yes. He almost regretted it, though. He had not seen all of Julie's true colors until one St. Paddy's Day. Tim and Julie planned to meet up at a pub, but Julie was running a little late. When she walked in, Tim was sitting at the bar talking to a blonde girl. Without saying one word, Julie walked up to Tim and punched him square in the face. Ultimately, this led to a black eye, and as you expected, Tim was blown away. It completely took him by surprise. It was very embarrassing. He wasn't doing anything wrong from his point of view. It was an innocent conversation to pass the time until Julie got there. Of course, he knew Julie was on her way, and he was probably going to introduce them to one another. Tim had to get Julie to chill out, but even after that, she told him, "First, I'll kick her ass for talking to you, and then I'll kick her ass for being a blonde." That struck me as very odd. Why hurt someone over the way that they look? I don't know. Did she have something against blondes? Was the woman that her dad cheated on a blonde? I don't know, but all I know is I wondered what that had to do with an innocent girl. There was also quite a double standard at play. Julie was someone that overtly flirted with men. She expected that to be okay with Tim, but if he stepped out of line in her perspective, her temper would rage. There was a lot of emotional baggage there, and there were two chefs in the kitchen in their relationship. They both wanted to make the rules. Julie was 21, and ironically, she was working at a law firm doing the exact same type of work that Tim's secretary did for him, another kind of double standard. It was okay that she worked for men, and it was fine that she was a secretary, but it wasn't okay for Tim to need one. Julie would constantly tell Tim that she wasn't comfortable with it, and even made comments to the secretary. Julie was at work one day when a local newspaper called the Trentonian landed on her desk. An article that was in the newspaper caught her eye immediately, and it was an ad looking for girls that lived in the area to enter a beauty contest. Julie had stars in her eyes. She ripped it out, brought it home, and showed it to Tim. Tim was a former photographer, and he got excited. There was a cash prize as well as vacations and other perks involved. He told Julie she should enter, and he would take all of her pictures. So they wasted no time. Tim thought Julie had the perfect bikini body ever since they first met, and they went on that date surfing. He was 100% confident that she would win first prize, no doubt about it. So he took a bunch of her photos, and then they submitted it to the Trentonian. I'm very familiar with this newspaper. I used to live in New Jersey. In order to sell more newspapers, they had a very clever marketing strategy, and I'm guessing their demographic was men. They had this special page, page 6, dedicated to swimsuit models. I know because I was one of them. I was in pageantry for years. This is just a small caveat, and that's how I found myself in New Jersey, and this is what drew me to want to learn more about this case. It was a fun pastime for me. I learned a lot. But the newspaper was always looking for new girls. My best friend and I were approached while we were just working on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. I was selling casino memberships. I was young, and I thought it would be pretty cool to be in a newspaper. But I'm telling you all this for context. It's not a big deal. It wasn't anything to be bragging about per se, but it was fun. Julie didn't just do it for fun, though. She really thought this was her chance. She could probably use this to catapult herself into a career in modeling. Julie hadn't heard a response, though, and it had already been a week. Maybe she was in a bad mood, but all we know is that Tim walked into his office to find his secretary was gone. The phones were ringing off the hook. He didn't know what was going on, and then Julie just strolled out and took a seat at the secretary's desk. Of course, Tim was confused. He asked, "What's going on, Julie?" She's got a big smile and she says, "I guess she just left." But Tim wasn't an idiot. He knew Julie. He knew that she must have made that poor girl feel so bad that she walked out. Because it was clear from the beginning Julie was trying to sabotage the professional relationship between Tim and his secretary. All the attention had to be on Julie and Julie alone. Tim could not run his business alone, and Julie knew that, so she gave him pretty much no choice but to let her run his business. She quit the law firm and then came into Tim's office, reworking all of the processes that were already in place. She sort of took control of everything. This wasn't a bad thing. Tim was old school. He was still working off paper ledgers, and Julie transitioned everything onto a computer. The thing was, when you gave her an inch, she would take a mile, and she knew she had Tim wrapped around her finger. He gave her so much freedom, and she loved that because she could go out and party, do whatever she wanted, and Tim would never give her a hard time about it. She had been working at Tim's for a couple of months, and she was opening the mail every day. She still had not heard back from the newspaper, and she was pissed. Instead of realizing that maybe she didn't make the cut, she decided to go down to their office to question them about why she hadn't been given a response. I guess some people can look at this as being persistent, and I know persistence can pay off. But then some people may look at it a little bit differently. Maybe she just didn't get what she wanted, and she thought she deserved it. You could call it entitlement, but I'm not sure. She shows up, she barges in, and she demands to talk to the editor. The editor didn't even know her. They get hundreds of random entries from girls all over New Jersey. When she gets to see him, her exact words were, "Yo, what gives? Why isn't my picture in the newspaper?" The editor was shocked. This is not something he saw every day. He had actually never had this happen before. He did give Julie a chance to speak, and I don't know what they talked about, but she did end up getting accepted into the beauty pageant and would also be featured on page 6 of the Trentonian. Julie couldn't hold back her excitement about what she had accomplished, so she announced it to all of her friends and to Tim, and they started preparing for the competition. You're going to find that the competition didn't go as Julie planned. It was only the second time that the Trentonian even held one of these beauty contests. And just so you're aware, all these contests are just for publicity. They're for marketing and finding more models for their newspaper. They would make girls like me when I was 18 feel special. Then they knew you were more likely to want to participate in more and more. They would give you gifts, hotel stays, VIP club access. They even drove me around in a limo, Some refer to this as grooming, and one reason why is because they would also introduce you to high rollers. And those high rollers would want a female companion, and they would even hand us their room keys. I think you know where I'm going with this. Being in this contest, from my perspective, isn't that big of an ordeal. There were only 12 girls that were named as finalists, and they were competing for a trip to California as well as, get this, a chance. And this is what I'm talking about with the way that these beauty pageants go, a chance to enter another bikini contest. Wow. That's what you're getting when you're winning a trip to California and a chance to enter another contest. Well, there were a couple of hundred people that came to the Marriott, a pretty big crowd. They were there to watch the women, mostly men in the crowd. Do I think these contests are rigged? Yes, I do. But that could also just be a conspiracy theory. I don't know. What I do know is that Julie was very confident she was going to win, because just a few weeks ago her picture appeared in the Trentonian's page 6, as promised by the editor. She definitely thought that was going to give her a leg up in the competition. There she was, 5'7", and one of her most prominent attributes, and this is from what I read, so I had to mention it, was her large chest. That got her a lot of attention, and she knew how to show it off in the right way. This wasn't just a beauty contest. This was something she thought was going to completely change her life. All eyes were on her. This is what she always dreamed of. Just keep that in mind. Ever since she found out that the editor was going to let her compete, she spent so much time buying swimsuits, trying them on for Tim, and posing to make sure she had the right stance as well as a perfect look for this competition. She was practicing any time she had free time. She took this very seriously. She learned how to walk down the runway and answer questions because, if you didn't know, they ask you all these silly questions. So this is what they call the personality phase, where you get to answer some questions so that the judges know you're not just a pretty face, so to speak. And this is where the whole thing about the large chest comes in. She asked him, "What are 3 words that you would use to describe me?" Because that was one of the previous year's questions, and he literally said, quote, "Skinny, big tits." That's what he said. So the girls are gathered on stage, and they would take their turn standing in front of the judges. Julie didn't go until the end, and maybe they were saving the best for last. I'm sure that's what she thought anyway. You know what these beauty pageants are like, and if you don't, you've got the bikini-clad women, usually very tan, either spray-tanned or back then from using tanning beds. But I don't want you to think this is easy, because it's not. It's pretty nerve-wracking. The crowd is filled with all these men, they're catcalling you, they're screaming to get your attention, because they think after you walk off stage, you're going to give them a chance. That's also why the judges want to be part of these competitions. Most times, unfortunately for Julie, only one of the judges chose her to be a winner. All the other judges did not agree, and she did not even place in the competition. Not only did she feel defeated, she was angry, and as soon as she walked off that stage, she went right to Tim and told him that she was way prettier than the girl that won. All she got to take home were some measly vouchers for a store nearby, and that's pretty harsh in my opinion. It's like, here's a voucher for your time because I told you these things are pretty much a joke. They really are. While she was at the competition, she met another model. Her name is Cheryl Chupless. They ended up becoming really good friends. Cheryl was talking to another editor of the Trentonian, and he's responsible for hiring promotional models. The editor's name was Gail Baldwin, and he knew he didn't have anyone on his roster that looked like Julie. He was talking to her, and she was eating this up. She was so happy that people were giving her this attention. She was on top of the world in that moment. Knowing, okay, I didn't win this competition, but I just made 2 solid connections. They would be hired to go to places like bars and get the crowds hyped up on one of the newest drinks. They would hand out samples for the patrons to test out, and 9 times out of 10, it's usually an alcohol company. So Gail hires both Cheryl and Julie to become one of the new promo girls. And what's funny is when they said that Cheryl and her became really good friends, I laughed because Cheryl was a blonde. Just throwing that out there, because you remember what happened at the pub on that St. Paddy's Day with the other blonde? I guess as long as you don't flirt with her man, she's fine with you being a blonde. And that's good, because I didn't want someone else to get punched in the face. Julie got her first promo job in the summer, and she was sent out to a few bars and a nightclub to promote a company called Hub City Beer. She did such a good job, and her and Cheryl were like a tag team. They had such good chemistry that they started sending them out with each other time and time again. They were working a few nights a week. Ultimately, they got hired for gigs for Miller Brewing Company and Coors Light. They were going all over South Jersey Shore, doing these promotions. For Julie, it was second nature. She had a very extroverted personality. She loved talking to people. She would go right up to them. She wouldn't just do the promotion, she would stay afterward, and men would buy her drinks. Her and Cheryl would just party it up. They became very popular in the local nightclub scene. They were actually handing out their schedules so that mostly guys would know where they would be on any given night. There were baseball players that were even following them from bar to bar during the week. All the while, Julie was still working her full-time job at her boyfriend Tim's landscaping company. Although Tim was proud of all her accomplishments, he never went to any of the events. He didn't get involved. He didn't go to her modeling shoots or the nightclub appearances. He was a homebody, completely opposite of Julie. Tim loved to spend time at home with his dog. And I'm the exact same way, so I can totally relate. The more promo work she did, the more modeling jobs she was getting, and ultimately she had this big surprise for her mom. They're driving in the car together, and she says, "Mom, look." And she's on a huge billboard right over the highway in her bikini, and this was an ad for, guess who, the Trentonian. It gave her a lot of exposure and helped her get even more modeling gigs. The modeling gigs were paying off for Julie, and they were also paying off for the Trentonian because their sales kept going up right after adding these women to the papers. They noticed a really steep increase, probably because, like I said, their demographic is men. Julie was becoming a local celebrity. Everywhere she went, people would recognize her. I'm sure it made her feel pretty famous because she was in this bubble where everybody knew who she was, and she was being invited to all kinds of new events and fundraisers, rubbing elbows with important people. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, right? By the fall of 1990, things were really slowing down when it came to the promotional work. Now Julie started entering even more beauty pageants, because even if she didn't place, she would still win some money. And it also can be somewhat of an addiction, the rush of planning for the contest, being on stage, and the anticipation of finding out if you won, and then the letdown when it's over. She did win some titles. She held the title for Miss Muscle Cars, Miss Hawaiian Tropic, Miss New Jersey, and Miss Beach Haven. She was in a really happy place at this time in her life, but there was something she wanted. She wanted Tim to take their relationship to the next level, and she was putting a lot of pressure on him to pose. Specifically, she wanted him to propose before Christmas. Oh, she had no shame. She was very persistent. Tim even called her controlling, but he finally gave in. Just like she marched down to the newspaper, persistently asking them to put her on page 6 and then announcing it once it happened, she did the same thing once Tim proposed. She called up Cheryl to let her know right away. He proposed on Christmas morning, and just like she hadn't wasted any time preparing for the pageants, she wasted no time at all starting to plan for her wedding. This was going to be the most important day in her life. You can also imagine, if she took the competitions as seriously as she did, her wedding was going to be a huge affair that no one would forget. That summer, June 12th, Julie was once again on stage at her second Trentonian swimwear contest. This time they invited all their friends to get into the crowd and cheer for Julie when she was up on stage, because maybe that would make the judges see that she was clearly who they should pick. Unfortunately, once again Julie did not place. She did get a free bathing suit though, and a membership to the Hillsborough Country Club for a year. She was still getting featured on page 6 though, so that's a plus. But of course, remember, this is just a big selling strategy for the Trentonian. Julie was interested in stepping up her game, so she decided to try sending out headshots all over New York in hopes of becoming a famous actress, but that didn't pan out for her either. She thought the reason she wasn't hitting it big in New York was that she was spending so much time working for Tim. She couldn't possibly give modeling all of her time if she was at the office focusing on him and his business. The thing was, she couldn't stomach the idea of Tim hiring a secretary, so she remained working there because she didn't want him to hire someone else. Tim even told her, and these were his words, "I promise I'll only hire someone big, fat, and ugly," so she didn't have to worry about anything. After all, Tim was about to marry her. Julie's big day was finally here, November 16th, 1991. She walked down the aisle in a Catholic ceremony at St. Gregory's in New Jersey. She was only 23 when she and Tim tied the knot, and she looked perfect. Cheryl was Julie's maid of honor. She helped her pick out the perfect dress. They ended up settling on a $5,000 gown that reminded them of a princess dress. Maybe you would call Julie a bridezilla, I don't know. But she was very demanding and wanted every detail to be exactly the way she wanted, especially when she wanted to party longer. The venue they were having the reception at decided they were just going to close up at 10. And she was like, "No, I'm in my dress. I want to drink. I want to dance. You better open it back up." But whatever she said worked. Tim said she was able to get the bar back open. After the wedding, they went on a fabulous honeymoon vacation on a cruise ship to the Caribbean. They had such an amazing time that they decided they were going to make this an annual tradition. They were living very comfortably at this time. They had a combined income of close to about $200,000. This was generally more than enough for a couple to support themselves and be able to live a life free from any financial worry. And it's true. They really knew no limits to what money could do for them. They never had to worry about budgeting or spoiling themselves. Up until 1997, Julie's modeling career brought in increasingly high amounts of money each year. She was earning more and more. The couple were practically swimming in cash, having more than enough for anything that they needed. Julie did not settle down after they got married. She was busier than she had ever been. She was going to gigs all over Jersey and beyond. But there was one thing that she was spending even more time on, and that was finding the perfect house. Not just any house, Julie wanted a house in a very nice neighborhood. They finally found one in Mansfield Township. This is a very affluent area, and it's in the middle of Philadelphia and New York. She thought this would give her an opportunity to do more modeling gigs. In the fall of 1992, they finally moved into their house, and she did not spare a second renovating the entire place to suit her taste. Julie seemed to have it all from the outside, but there was something Julie wasn't able to accomplish. She had never placed in the Trentonian beauty contest, and this was her third time trying. She dedicated months at this point because she really wanted to place this time, and she got lucky. She came in second place and won $500 and a trip to Jamaica. The next step was the big screen. Well, not exactly, but she did find herself on TV. There was a lot of controversy going on regarding Trentonian's Page 6, which eventually landed Julie on the Maury Povich show. The Trentonian decided to send Julie as their spokesperson, maybe because she knew the most about the newspaper. She had been posing for Page 6 for a long time. Julie was also very well spoken. She was educated, beautiful, and seemed perfect to represent them and defend the newspaper. There were activists and women's rights groups saying that this newspaper exploits women, and Julie just said, "You know what? It's fun. That's all you need to worry about." Then, in a bold move, she stripped down to her bikini on stage for shock value. She was pretty much like, "Hey, this is it. This is what you see. Is this bad?" Her friends mentioned how it seemed like they were living two separate lives and that they were distant from one another. Julie did feel insecure after she heard that, and she was wondering if Tim even loved her. They wouldn't hug, they wouldn't touch when they were together, and they hardly had sex anymore. Julie just didn't feel like doing it. They had even gotten into several arguments about it. Sometimes they would get into fights that would make them go into the silent treatment with each other. Julie bought a video camera, an 8mm video camera, and she actually became somewhat of a vlogger before YouTube and all that was invented. She would turn the video camera on herself and talk about her day, doing day-in-the-life videos. Now, she wouldn't post them anywhere like we do now, but she loved to showcase what she was doing, like going crabbing or fishing, and just showcasing her hobbies. There was one hobby she also captured a lot of, and that was her hobby of excessively drinking. Julie started to confide in one of her and Tim's mutual friends. His name was Tony Capella. She would tell him about the relationship, her dreams, and what she wanted to do in life, and they became very close. He would give her advice and try to persuade her to stop partying so much and pay attention to her relationship. He also didn't like going to parties with her because he wasn't comfortable with some of the party favors that she enjoyed doing. But there were times when Tim and Julie would hang out. They would go on double dates with another couple named Mark and Tracy. The first time Julie met Tracy, she walked right up and said, "Yo, I'm Julie. Who are you?" At first, Tracy was very uncomfortable. It threw her for a loop. But eventually, she came to understand that this was just Julie's way. She was a girl from Philly, and she had that kind of abrasive exterior. But sooner or later, Tracy learned that Julie was very kind, and they got along really well and became very good friends. But her friends noticed she wasn't just addicted to drinking and going out. She was also addicted to attention itself. What I mean by that is, everyone around her would notice that when she went out partying, she would come alive. And once she came home and was back on Earth, she got sad. It was actually like withdrawal symptoms. She would be looking for the next exciting thing to give her that rush. It was 1994, and her family was thinking she needed to add something to her life. Remember when Julia was alone when John was working? She felt like she needed a new purpose, and of course, Julia wanted a grandchild, so she tried to convince Tim and Julie to have a baby. They had enough money coming in, so they thought this was probably a good time to try. But Julie was really scared of something. She thought pregnancy would ruin her body, and then she would have to give up all of her dreams and all the opportunities. But it happened in February 1995. She got pregnant. Julie was excited. She told everyone. Tim wanted to be a dad so bad. The pregnancy was actually helping them bond again. They felt more connected than ever. When Julie was 5 months pregnant, she was ready to show off that baby bump. She threw a big party for the summer. She had a Hawaiian luau, and she wore a one-piece bikini swimsuit with a thong. Now, the thing that people noticed at this party, and you can take it any way you want, it's her body, her choices. I guess she never stopped drinking or smoking while she was pregnant. Her friends said they felt very uncomfortable, and they would tell her, but she wouldn't listen to them. You couldn't control what she did. You would get into a fight. So most people would just bite their tongue. Not only did she not like the fact that people were trying to control her, but she also didn't like the fact that she didn't have control over her own body. She was starting to gain weight, which is to be expected in pregnancy, but it made her depressed. Oh, and don't get me started on the way she would react if someone pointed out her belly. Remember, she was popular in town, and of course people would say something like, "Oh wow, your big belly." It wasn't intended to be an insult, but Julie took it that way. She would go off on strangers left, right, and center, and no, it wasn't just yelling. She actually punched a man in the face. On November 26, 1996, Julie gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Katie Scarlett. Now this might be a surprise or maybe not, but after Katie was born, Julie did change. She loved being a mom. It does that to a lot of people. You want to shut everything off and spend all of your time on this little human being. She was no longer turning the camera on herself in her own videos. She was turning it on Katie, talking about how cute she was. Her mother, Julia, was coming over more than ever to help her with little Katie. Anytime Julie needed something or had to go out, Julia was there to babysit. Don't think this didn't cause problems. Julie and Julia fought all the time about how Katie was going to be raised. Sometimes it would get so bad that Julie would tell her mother to leave and never come back. They wouldn't see each other for a while, until Julie needed her again. One reason behind these arguments was resentment. Now that Julie was a mom, she wanted to give her child the best life possible. She started to think about her own childhood. She'd get pretty upset when she realized, if you love a child so much, How in the world could you treat them the way her parents did? Just the fact that her father would leave like that, did they even love her? Just like her mother had in the past, Julie started to fall into a deep depression. Tim and everyone close to her tried again and again to have her snap out of it, but she couldn't. The pregnancy pounds were also a big source of insecurity. They just would not come off. She still had an extra 35 pounds that she had gained during her pregnancy, but she wasn't making any attempt to do anything about it. Maybe it was the depression. She wouldn't work out and she couldn't get out of bed. So then she was depressed. And it was a vicious cycle. When she looked at her body, it made her miss the times when she was free to do whatever she wanted. Now, I'm glad this next thing happened because it did bring some clarity to what was going on. Julie was finally diagnosed with postpartum depression. Her doctor ended up prescribing her medication, and it did help. Though Julie had good intentions at times, she was still selfish. It was hard for her to split her time between the things she wanted to do and being there for her family, and it caused problems in her relationship. Finally, in April 1997, Tim and Julie decided they needed to go to marriage counseling. Tim knew their relationship was not going to mend itself. It wasn't working. But the counseling did not work because, even though the therapist was supposed to be impartial, Julie felt as though the therapist was siding with Tim. The truth is, the therapist was digging deep into Julie's past and figuring out that a lot of the problems stemmed from things she really needed to work out from her childhood. But Julie didn't feel comfortable with that. She decided couples counseling was not for her. Besides, Julie had her own therapist. Her therapist said that the marriage was falling apart because of Tim. It was his fault. He wasn't giving her enough attention and affection, and he didn't see things Julie's way. He didn't socialize the way that she did, and they were just growing apart. Julie decided she was probably going to leave him. It was like something just flipped in her, and then she just considered herself single again. She started partying really hard. She would come home drunk and high. She was doing a lot of cocaine. She would show up at events, like a black tie event one of her friends had, and in the middle of the meal, she would just leave. Later, they would find out she was downtown, scoring cocaine and partying all night. And that would hurt her friends, especially her mom, Julia. Because remember, Julia was always afraid that Julie was going to go down the same path when it came to drugs. When Julia found a rolled-up $20 bill while doing laundry at Julie's house, she freaked out. Julie was taking Prozac with cocaine and then she was drinking. They had this perfect life, and Tim kept telling her, if you can't be happy with everything that you have right now, a loving family, a mom who cares about you and your daughter and wants to help you, what's going to make you happy? What more do you want? They decided that maybe they could rekindle the romance by going on a cruise. They planned one for November, and remember, this was an annual tradition. They usually went every January to start the year off right. This time they said, let's do it earlier as a Christmas gift to ourselves. They booked a week-long cruise on Celebrity Cruise Line on a brand new ship called the Galaxy. It had everything. It was super luxurious, with a casino, a nightclub, and a theater. They left on Saturday, November 1st. They flew to San Juan, Puerto Rico to board the ship. On the first night when Tim headed back to the room to watch the hockey game, Julie was bored. So being Julie, she hit up the casino. While walking down the corridor, she caught the eye of a man named George Skiadopoulos. We're going to be calling him by his first name, George. He was one of the engineers on the Galaxy. It might sound impressive, but it was the lowest officer position in the engineering department. The most significant responsibility that George had was to safely and effectively perform lookouts on certain parts of the ship. But his uniform made him look very official and important. Julie was dressed up. She was wearing a low-cut dress. George took a mental note, thinking he had to introduce himself if he saw her again. The next morning he got his chance. The ship docked on a beach in the Dominican Republic, and Julie decided to go swimming. She was lying on a raft in her bikini while Tim was relaxing on the shore. George had a day off. He was allowed to spend time at the same beach, and he spotted Julie. She definitely wasn't hard to miss. He told his fellow crewmates she was the most beautiful girl on the cruise ship, and he made a bet that he would be able to get her to come back to his cabin. George was only 22 years old. This is a young guy just starting his career. He had graduated from high school not too long ago. Someone like me, I wouldn't know what a third engineer meant. If you told me you worked on a cruise ship and were wearing a nice uniform, I would probably believe you were the captain, for all I know. George wasted no time. He went right up to Julie, introduced himself, and sort of made her believe he was in a higher position than he was on the ship. Julie was excited, thinking, okay, he's going to be able to get me into swanky VIP parties. She connects with people all the time. This is what she does. She didn't think anything more of it, whereas a man might be thinking, she's giving me attention, she's flirting with me, she's interested, I have a chance. No, at this point, Julie just wanted to get something. She was thinking, how can I achieve my goal by connecting with George? Tim's not the jealous type, we know that. He's used to seeing Julie talk to people all the time. This was no different. He looked over and saw them talking, but didn't even give it a second thought. As a matter of fact, when he first saw George, he thought, oh, I wonder who that prematurely bald-looking dude with really bad teeth is, talking to Julie. George had a really thick accent. He told Julie he was Greek. She told him she was a model, and he said he could have guessed. They were kind of bragging about their accomplishments, and George lied, telling her he was 28. At this point, Julie waved to Tim and told George, that's my husband. George took that as a signal to come down the beach and introduce himself. The first thing Tim said, upon finding out that George worked on the ship, was kind of the same thing Julie was expecting. Can you get us any perks? The best that George could offer at that time was to give them a tour of the engine room. They thought that was cool. They would have something special that most people don't get to see. But today was not the day. They finished their conversation and went their separate ways, not really planning anything concrete, just saying they might see each other around. The next morning, though, they got a call from George asking how everything was going. It was a little odd. They had been on cruise ships before and had never been called that way, but he was friendly. They did ask to be taken on a tour of the engine room, so they thought nothing of it. What Julie might not have noticed was that they kept bumping into each other. It wasn't a coincidence. Especially if Tim was with Julie, George would not stop and talk to her. But if she was alone, they would chat it up. Julie told Tim she was the happiest she'd been in a long time. She told him she knew this was going to bring back the romance in the relationship. On the last night of their trip, they got another call from George. This time he said, I'll take you to the engine room. They met up, he invited them inside, and took them around. Julie got pictures, and all the while, George was breaking the rules, but this did seem to impress them. This was the very last time they would probably see George. Tim thought it would be nice to have a connection on Celebrity Cruise Line, so he told Julie to get George's information to keep in touch. They exchanged addresses. However, there was something happening. There seemed to be an instant chemistry between George and Julie. It wouldn't be evident to anyone on the outside, but she had to tell someone. When she returned home, she called up Tony and made him swear he wouldn't say anything, but she needed to get something off her chest. She talked about how she met George and felt something different. She said it was probably nothing, but she definitely felt a physical attraction. Of course, Tony didn't take it seriously. He said, listen, you're never going to see this guy again. He lives in Greece. Who cares? He told her she didn't do anything wrong and to just let it go. After she settled back in, Julie focused on what was important, her husband and daughter, the two people she loved most in her life. However, she was still feeling empty from her marriage. The cruise really didn't do much. It was a temporary fix, and she wasn't feeling as pretty as she did before. She wasn't getting the same attention from Tim. She would remember the way she felt when George first met her. He went out of his way to talk to her. Maybe that's why she felt attracted to him. She truly loved feeling like she was someone special. Even though she knew she was attractive enough to appear on magazines and billboards, it still seemed like Julie couldn't get the attention she was used to. And as much as she loved Tim, it seemed as though he could never satisfy the craving she had to be on top of a pedestal. The thing I was thinking, though, is that Tim did everything for her. He loved her, he supported her, and he let her into his life and his business, but it was never enough. She almost saw it as a burden. Julie was bored. She was getting ready to turn 30 and started thinking about her life. She was beginning to feel like she wasn't getting what she wanted out of the marriage. She started thinking about George and how he had the qualities she was looking for. He was exciting. But soon enough, Julie and Tim went back to their everyday life and daily routines. Julie continued to keep everything inside. Their life was falling back into place until George started to contact Julie. It began with a nice letter saying that he hoped the couple had enjoyed the cruise and that if they ever needed anything on their next trip, they should let him know. Then it became more intense. This was George's plan. It went from letters to talking on the phone, and soon enough, they were in contact every single day. One of George's main goals was to convince Julie that Tim wasn't good enough for her. He made himself out to be this perfect guy who was going to treat her better. Julie wasn't exactly keeping these phone calls a secret from Tim because he had caught her several times talking in very hushed tones over the phone. On one occasion, or several actually, he would pick up the phone, know it was George, and just say, "Hey, here, Julie. George wants to talk to you," and thought nothing of it. Months went by. Julie pretended nothing had changed, but the act could only go on for so long. George and Julie were confiding in one another. Julie was finding out so much about George, and the more she found out about him, the more she realized that they had a lot more in common than she and Tim, or so she thought. George was ambitious. He came from a hard-working family in Greece, from a small fishing town. Remember Julie's love for fishing, which Tim didn't exactly share? But the big thing they had in common was that both of their fathers cheated. George was raised by his mom and his grandma. When he was 14 years old, his dad cheated while his mother was pregnant with his little brother, and then his father left to go live with his mistress. It was traumatizing for George, and Julie could relate. Throughout his whole childhood, he had an obsession with escaping to another world, and he had a love for the ocean. He would sit and stare at the ocean, dreaming of escaping his small village and going on vacations all over the world. That's what drew him into wanting to work on cruise ships. Just like Julie growing up, George was attractive and popular, and he was a really good student, but he was also somewhat of a recluse, and not many people were close to him, so you can see how George and Julie would bond. She's always dated older guys, and now she was getting the attention of a younger guy as she was getting older. This might have been exciting for her. Even though Julie was keeping this a secret, they ended up having an amazing Christmas as a family. It was Katie's very first one, and Tim went out of his way to make it memorable. He even had someone dress up as Santa Claus, come over to the house and give gifts to everyone. Sadly, Julie was just not present. She was off in her own head, and now her daughter was the center of attention. Julia did not think Julie was giving Katie her all. She wanted her to be an attentive mother. She wanted her to pay attention in the moment. So they would go back and forth with these fights, with her mom coming back and forth and in and out of her life. On January 3rd, 1998, Tim decides to throw her a surprise party for her 30th, hoping to bring her spirits up, bring her back down to earth, and have a little fun. He gets all of her friends together, and he's right, it's a really happy time. They had a lot of fun, and later Julie says she wants one more gift for her birthday. She wants to take another cruise. Tim didn't really have to be convinced. This was a tradition, so he asked, "Where are we going this time?" This is when Tim got confused. He was expecting a different ship, a different destination, but Julie insists they go on the same ship to the same place. Tim is standing there bewildered, asking, "Why?" Of course, he didn't want to upset her because she was up and down with her depression, so he's like, "Okay, why not?" We know the real reason that she wants to go back on the ship. It's pretty obvious. I'm surprised it wasn't clear to Tim, but she wants to test her attraction to George. She wants to know, if she sees him again, is she going to feel the same, or is this going to fade? Is it just some kind of fantasy, or is there something more? Friday, February 13th, Julie and Tim went back to San Juan and got on their cruise once again. And guess who's there to greet them? George. This time, George was bombarding them more than last time. He was always calling, always trying to meet up with them. Tim was getting annoyed, especially because they were on the exact same cruise, on the exact same islands, doing the exact same thing. He was bored out of his mind. There might have been a little suspicion coming from Tim, because one night they get into a fight. Julie had met some girls on the cruise, and she wanted to go out. I don't know if she asked him to accompany her or not, but she tells Tim that George is going to come. He just says, "Go on and go," and he stays behind to go to bed. This is when that little bet that George made with his crewmates comes into action. Julie gets obliterated, crying in George's arms, explaining how she feels trapped in her marriage. He pulls the biggest trick in the book. He says, "Let's go and talk in my cabin." Cha-ching. Money in his hand. He knew it. There, in his cabin, he's showering her with compliments, telling her how beautiful she is, how much he loves her. He loves her. This is only the second time that they've seen each other. At first, Julie was a little timid. She was standoffish, although she was vulnerable in that moment. She did not want to be disloyal. I mean, this is what her dad did. This is what George's dad did. What hypocrites. She fell for it. With her husband just down the hall, she fell for it. Not only did they kiss, but they also had sex. In that moment, it was something that Julie couldn't describe. When she tried to explain it later to friends, she just told them there was this passion there. She couldn't figure out why. She knew that she had this intense feeling of what seemed like love, but it wasn't clear why a gorgeous woman with a successful career and a life that anyone would be jealous of would think about trading it for this young man with practically nothing to offer. Why was Julie so attracted to him? Was it the attention that he was giving her? He seemed desperate to do anything she wanted because he wanted her to stick around. That night, she returned to her cabin and snuck back in, being as quiet as possible. She climbed right into bed with Tim, and all the while, she's got this secret burning inside of her. She couldn't sleep because all night she was just thinking about George. She knew this is what she wanted. She wanted to be with him. Poor Tim, he has no idea that any of this is going on. When they return home, she's actually in a really good mood, and once again, he's thinking it's the cruise. Every time they go on a cruise, she's happy again. When she tells her friend Cheryl about George, she can't believe it. Julie had this arrogant attitude too. She's like, "Listen, I met someone else. I'm not gonna let Tim hurt me anymore." And I'm sitting here thinking, what was Tim doing wrong? I mean, I don't know him personally, and I can't get right into the relationship, but what was Tim not doing enough of? This gave Julie the determination to get in the best shape of her life for George. She wanted to feel confident again and live a new life. When Tony found out, remember, he didn't think anything of it, and he was friends with Tim. Even though he was a confidant for Julie, he did not agree with this relationship. He was not okay keeping secrets. He was also Katie's godfather, so he felt very uncomfortable with the fact that he would have to keep this secret from a little girl whose mother was doing the exact thing that her father did. When Tony asked how far it went, Julie actually told him the truth, and he was even more upset. He told Julie, "I can't talk about this anymore," and then he reminded her about her past. Now Katie was going to have to go through that same thing. She pretty much lost Tony as a friend at this point because he couldn't keep those secrets. He couldn't have it on his conscience. Tony told people everything was about Julia all the time, and she decided she was going to have a little trip of her own. All about herself and her happiness, she returned to San Juan secretly to hook up with George. She had this master plan. She took Katie and her mom to visit her brother in Florida. It wasn't too far from Puerto Rico. She ends up admitting everything to Julie on the trip. Can you believe that? After Julia was cheated on, Julie let her mom in on all of her secrets. When her mom asked how far it went, Julie lied. Either way, Julia was upset. She said, "It's not okay, you have Katie, this is stupid, it's going to lead to something really bad and you're going to regret it." On March 26, 1998, after flying to Florida, She gets up the very next morning and goes straight to Puerto Rico to meet up with George. They had a day of complete adultery. Not only that, they started to talk about what they were going to do next. Now, we're not going to know exactly what they talked about. I don't know whether George wanted her to break up with him or not. It didn't matter. He was involved in breaking up this marriage and tearing it apart whether he wanted to or not. To me, actions speak louder than words. When she got back home, she still talked to George non-stop, and it was getting more and more frequent. She was taking more risks, writing these love letters and kissing them with red lipstick. I mean, Tim could have seen them at any moment. She even started recording home videos for George to watch. All the while, she was living off of Tim's salary, going on shopping sprees, and doing whatever she wanted. In her mind, she was single again. She was going out partying and doing a lot more cocaine. She wanted to see George more and more, but Julia forbade it. She said she wasn't going to watch Katie in order for her to go cheat on her husband. She was giving less and less attention to Tim. Now, being married for 7 years, they had to figure out what was wrong, so they went back to counseling. During the very first meeting, Julie looks over at Tim and says, "I want a separation." Tim says, "No, we're getting a divorce." The counselor was trying to mediate it, trying to find some middle ground, but Tim said he doesn't believe in that. It's either we're on or we're off, we're together or we're not. So, Tim decides he's going to leave. He moves out, and they're going to figure out what they're going to do next. Julie was once again controlling the situation and getting exactly what she wanted. The thing she didn't get was access to the money. She had to do everything herself. If she was going to leave the marriage, she had to be independent. Remember though, they were running this business together. She still had a stake in it. She was still doing her part for Sterling Lawns. She was also acting like a young and free woman and going through somewhat of a midlife crisis. George tells her, "You need to move to Greece so that we can be together." All the while, Tim had no say in any of this. She figures she's just going to leave with Katie and say goodbye, all for this young Greek sailor. She definitely wasn't thinking clearly. It's hard to believe that she would actually be in such a different state of mind thinking this was acceptable. Was it the drugs? Was it the lust? As they say, love is blind. Even her friends thought, okay, she's going to snap out of it at any moment. It's just a phase, right? Tim's father had warned him about going into business with Julie. Sterling Lawns was now $1 million company, and Julie wanted her share. She needed some money because she was planning to move to Greece with Katie now, so she needed to save up. Don't think Julie didn't think about what it would be like leaving the life she had, though, especially without knowing if life with George would be better. She did have this nagging feeling that she needed to get to know George just a little bit more before she picked up her entire life and moved to another country. He was so persistent, though. One time he writes this letter to her, and in the letter, he's trying to convince her that when people are trying to make a really big decision, they have all this fear inside, but what they really need to do is trust their feelings and not facts. Basically, this was very manipulating, because we all know feelings, they come, they go, they're up, they're down, especially when you're dealing with an emotionally unstable person to begin with. This is also when George told Julie some upsetting news. He had to serve a mandatory 20-month military service. It was required for every Greek man, and there was no way out of it. It had just been looming over his head. Julie was so worried. She felt like if she didn't see him soon, he was going to slip away. They tried to concoct a plan at first where he could get a visa, come live in New Jersey, hide out, or just escape and lie to avoid the military. But they knew, in reality, that wasn't going to work. For some reason, she ends up telling George that she's taking Prozac and other prescription drugs to help with her mood swings. George kind of goes ballistic. He tells her he doesn't believe in medication and that she needs to get rid of them right away. This was more manipulation. If she wasn't stable, then she could easily be taken advantage of more and more, like her own mother. Julie traded one drug for another. She was going hard with cocaine. She was up at all hours of the night, obsessively faxing George. That's how they were keeping in contact. Not only was she taking cocaine, but she was also taking sleeping pills. cocaine to stay awake, sleeping pills to go to sleep, all while working out constantly. By the summer, she had lost at least 20 pounds. Now she wanted to get back into modeling. She was finally ready to get some gigs and make some more cash. But do you think George was going to let that happen? No. This wasn't Tim we're talking about. This was a 22-year-old boy. He was extremely jealous, and he didn't want her to do it. She had already booked several gigs. She had been planning this. He told her it was inappropriate for her to be going to bars and doing these promotions with these men. Even though she tried to convince him it was innocent, it's just a job. He demanded she quit immediately. Just like that, she started canceling all of her modeling gigs. Cheryl, who had done so much modeling with her, was confused and confronted her. She said it was very unprofessional and frustrating because they used to be a team. She was yelling at Julie, saying, "You're worried about some guy on a cruise ship? You're caring what he thinks about? Tim never stopped you from doing this. I can't believe you're letting him tell you what to do." Julie was losing all of her friends. She tried to confide in George, and he would tell her, "You're better off not having these friends. Just cut them off." This was another way for him to gain power. On July 16th, Tim had to do some work at his office. He needed to go inside their home to access business documents, and to his surprise, he was locked out. There was a big sign on the door that Julie had written, and it said, "Do not enter." Tim realized, this is going to affect my business, so he had no choice but to call the police. I'm only telling you this part because I want to show you the state of mind Julie was in. She was livid, arguing with the police. It wasn't until her attorney came to the house that she was able to calm down, and it was possible to get Tim into the home so he could remove all his files and move into a new office. Not only that, Julie became paranoid. She thought people were spying on her and that Tim was hiring them to follow her around. The people around her said she became delusional. She didn't trust her friends, anyone in her life, and especially not strangers. She thought everyone was working for Tim. She was trapped and would not even leave her house. She did not see that this relationship with George was toxic. By the middle of the summer, George and Julie got engaged, though they didn't tell anyone. She was 100% serious at this point about moving to Greece. She was going to do it in the new year. She started telling her friends that George was her future husband and that she was going to be planning their wedding. But then her friends wanted to see the engagement ring. It might sound shallow, but they were shocked. She had replaced the big diamond ring she had gotten from Tim with a cheap, gold, gumball machine-like ring with 2 dolphins on it and a little gemstone in the middle. This was all that George could afford, and Julie said she was fine with it. She didn't need an expensive ring because they were in love. And maybe it's true, it's just a superficial thing, just a material thing, but I thought, wow. The point is, she was making a lot of concessions to be with this man. It's just adding another one, that's all. Tim ends up receiving a phone bill because back then you had to pay for all of your calls, especially international calls and all the faxes. This bill was in the thousands. We're talking $6,000, $7,000, and he could not believe what he was seeing. So he was like, what the F is going on here? That was when he found out the truth, that all along, Julie was cheating on him with George. I'm sure people were just waiting for Tim to snap. A person can only take so much. Tim had never cheated. He had been completely loyal this whole time. Now he just wanted to finalize the divorce so he could move on and distance himself, to forget about the pain this was causing him. Julie was preparing to try to get custody of Katie so she could take her away from Tim and go to Greece. So much so that she was trying to get a restraining order to stop Tim from getting close to their daughter. Guess who was orchestrating all of this from the sidelines? George. Every move that Julie was making, he was behind it, though she might not have realized it. He drops a bomb on her. George surprises Julie and tells her he's coming to visit. She's kind of confused because he's got his job. He tells her, "Oh, I quit. For you, baby, I quit that job so I could spend time in New Jersey. How obviously can I pay for this?" Julie, of course, told him she was so happy because at this point her stress was mounting. Her hair was falling out, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, she was getting headaches, her stomach was upset. She thought all of this was because she was away from her love. Maybe it was the drugs, the obsessive working out, the lack of sleep. All these things can cause problems with stress. She goes ahead and buys George a plane ticket. She also decides to get him a wardrobe, because he had to be dressed to impress all of her friends that she was going to be introducing him to. Not only that, she decided to set him up with an appointment to get a professional hairpiece transplant kind of thing. Julie was also starting to become jealous and obsessive with George. If he wouldn't call her back, she would think he was cheating. Her mind would start racing. She was so far away and couldn't do anything. She questioned him about it, and she would tell him things like, "I can't believe you would go out with a friend while I'm sitting around waiting. I've been waiting all night. I've been up waiting for your call, waiting for your fax, and nothing. I can't believe you're out with friends again." Sort of this double standard. The day finally came, Friday, August 28th. George was finally in New Jersey. Julie was waiting for him right at the gate at the airport. Julie's mother wasn't very happy about this because she was still married to Tim, and Julia was the person who'd been by her side through all of this. Julia was on the outside, so she could look into the relationship that Julie had with George, and she was convinced that George was a gold digger. He just wanted Julie's money, and he wanted to manipulate her to get things from her. Why else would he quit his job if he wanted to move up the ladder? If he was so ambitious, like Julie said, this doesn't match up. She would listen to George, hear his conversations. He was intelligent, he was clever, he knew exactly what to say, and Julie was in a vulnerable position. Her mother thought he was preying on her. Not only that, he wanted to steal Julie away from her family and her daughter. They would have numerous discussions about how much money Julie was going to get in the settlement. Oh, and his teeth were absolutely disgusting. They were all rotting. So Julie asked her friend Mary, who was a dentist she went to high school with, if she would fix all of George's teeth. Of course, Mary said no. What was on her mind was George's hair transplant, his wig, whatever, and his clothes, and his teeth. Eventually, he did get some kind of toupee, and Julie warned her mom, like, "Listen, his hair is gonna look different. Don't say anything, don't make him feel bad." So George's feelings, that was what was important. When she introduced him to her friends or her family members, he would lie. He would say he made all this money, that he was basically like a captain of a ship. It was just pathological lies. And George hated Julie's mom. They didn't even know each other very well, but it was obvious that Julia did not approve. Julia would yell at Julie because she said she was acting like a teenager. She thought it was ridiculous. Tim finally found out that George was at their house. He was furious. He told Julie, "It's okay if you want to have a relationship, but what's not okay is that you're involving our daughter." Tim was getting increasingly frustrated. Julie was just charging everything to Tim's credit cards and Tim's accounts. He hadn't seen his daughter in weeks. She was keeping Katie away from him, mostly because George and Julie seemed to be in this warped, paranoid state of mind all the time. And they thought Tim was spying on them. So much so that they ripped down walls in the house looking for evidence of recording devices. Tim had had it up to his eyeballs. He decided he was going to fire Julie from the company because he wanted to separate himself as much as possible, and she wasn't even doing any work anymore while still getting her paycheck. At this point, he was ready. He was going to sign the settlement, so he agreed to pay Julie $600,000 just to end this mess and get it over with. I think Tim was starting to go crazy because he caught wind that Julie was trying to take away Katie. Now he had enough. He threatened her, saying, "If you don't get rid of this guy, George, and send him back to Greece, I'm not going to give you any money. And if you dare take my daughter away, I will come find you and take her back, and you will never see her again." Tim knew that he had a lot of witnesses to Julie's instability. There was no way a court was ever going to allow Julie to take Katie away to Greece, and she knew that. All of a sudden, George was gone, and everyone was shocked. They thought maybe she was finally coming to her senses. For a while, she seemed like herself again. It was a turning point in George and Julie's relationship. Maybe the finalizing of the divorce made Julie snap out of it a little bit, because she started telling her friends she may be having second thoughts about George. She said her feelings were kind of going up and down, and she was starting to think maybe this wasn't a good idea. I can't believe that it took her this long. Just a couple of weeks later, though, George and Julie were back at it again. She was torn. She didn't want to lose her daughter, but she also didn't want to lose the love of her life, or who she thought was the love of her life. She kept telling Cheryl she just needed to marry him. There was no other choice. But why? On October 20th, she flies to Greece to meet up with him to see if the feelings would still be there. Greece was beautiful. She had never lived anywhere like that. All the feelings. She finally thinks this confirmed it. George was the right choice. The next step was meeting his parents. They were taking this long drive, and George was showing her all around, discussing their plans. But all George kept emphasizing was that he couldn't wait to get the settlement money because he had convinced her to help him open a taxi cab business. He said it would be better than him going back on the cruise ships because they would get to spend more time together. It would be like Tim and Julie having their own company together, and the settlement money was going to help them so much. To Julia, it seemed like that's all he cared about. She chalked it up to him being excited. Remember, he was only 22 and didn't have much life experience. George was giving her the time of her life, taking her out to dinners, going on trips to different tourist spots, buying souvenirs. They even spent time filling out their application so they could get married in Greece in December. By October 25th, they were flying to his hometown, and she was finally going to meet his mom. All of a sudden, George's tone changed. He said, "We need to have a serious conversation before you step foot in my mother's home." She was just shy and staring at him, waiting. Then he said very sternly, "You can never let my mom know you are married, and more importantly, you can never ever let her know that you have a child." It turns out that his family was Greek Orthodox, and they would see this as immoral. There was a chance they would condemn or even disown him. It sounded crazy, but that's just the way it was. I thought this was wild because I wondered, how long could she keep that secret? She can't keep it forever. This is her child. But she played it off. Everyone seemed to like her and said she was lovely. When she returned home, she immediately began packing. Everything she owned was being shipped all the way to Greece. She didn't even have a place to live yet. It was like putting the cart before the horse, and no one could understand why in the world she would rush to do this. It was like she couldn't get away from her family fast enough. On November 22nd, she threw a party for little Katie's 3rd birthday. Everyone came, including the friends she had pushed away. They were there for Katie. All Julie talked about was her trip to Greece and how excited she was to move. Tony expected her to talk about how hard it was going to be to leave her family and Katie during the transition. But all she mentioned was that it was tough because she couldn't find anywhere to get her nails done. Tony felt sick to his stomach. Julie was set. She was planning to move on December 6th. Tim would take ownership of their house, and he was already starting to move things back in. On the day she was leaving, he noticed she was heavily intoxicated. He came by and saw her taking shot after shot. It wasn't his business or problem anymore, but he couldn't help feeling bad for her. Tim still loved her, even if Julie was a mess. Perhaps she thought, if I'm wasted, it's going to be easier to say goodbye. But Tim kept telling her, just rip the Band-Aid off, say goodbye, and leave, or you're going to miss your flight. Julie's friend Sue drove her to the airport to say goodbye. Julie was finally free. She arrived in Greece on December 8th, but she was shocked when she got there. She couldn't believe how bad the weather was. In October, when she came to visit, it had been sunny and beautiful. They had spent time on the beach, but now it was cold and absolutely dreadful, with a ton of snow on the ground. Even though some people might find snow pretty, this was not what she was expecting. But once she saw George, her world felt sunny again. They didn't have a place of their own yet. They were staying with George's mother. It really felt like they were teenagers again. They had a lot to do. They needed a marriage license, an apartment, and they were planning a wedding. It was overwhelming, but it was also really exciting. First on the list was getting a bank account to deposit the first portion of her settlement funds. They decided it would be best to get a joint bank account, since Julie didn't speak the language and would need George's help. Plus, they were about to be husband and wife. So, they deposited $80,000 into the joint account and kept $18,000 in cash. They were living the life, looking for apartments during the day and partying all night at different hotels and bars. Time flew by, and before they knew it, it was Christmas. Julie was still in touch with her friends, her mom, and Katie. She tried calling Katie on Christmas Eve, but she had been drinking and forgot about the time difference. She had to wait until the next day. When she finally called, she told Katie that she missed her and wished she could see the beautiful town of Kavala. Sunday, January 3rd, 1999, Julie turned 31, and they had a big party to celebrate. They were living in a luxury hotel until they finalized the lease on their apartment. It was one of the most expensive hotels in the area, called the Ignatia Hotel. Just a week later, they finally moved into their new apartment. It was in the most expensive area in Kavala. They prepaid the rent in cash for an entire year. On Friday, January 8th, Julie and George went to pick up their marriage license. They planned to get married on January 23rd. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Next stop, Athens, to pick up all of Julie's belongings that had finally been shipped from New Jersey. It was a 6-hour drive, but they were excited. Not only that, this was the only location the items could be shipped to, and that was okay. George wanted to show her how beautiful the country was. His grandmother and his father lived there, so they would have a place to stay at his grandmother's house. They were getting kind of a late start due to some bad news. George's brother was sick, and they had to meet his mom at the hospital. They did their very best to console his mom, but they knew they had to go. They didn't want to miss their appointment to pick up their rental car. They chose a white Fiat Punto, and by 5 p.m., they began their drive to Athens. George figured they would stop on the way if the weather got really bad or if they got hungry. Back in New Jersey, everyone's life was carrying on as usual, except when Sue got a call on Monday morning, January 11th. Sue was busy rushing around, getting her son ready for school, when her home phone started ringing. She picked up and heard a breathless, panicked voice on the other end. At first, she had no idea who it was. It was very hard for her to understand them, and the connection was terrible. Finally, she could make out the words, "I can't find her. I can't find her." It was George. Sue wasn't worried. She knew Julie. Julie was spontaneous. She told George to calm down and explain exactly what was going on. He told her about their drive to get Julie's things, his grandmother's, their plans, everything. She had spoken to Julie not too long ago, and Julie was not in a good mood, but she was used to that. That was the way she was. She could get upset at the drop of a hat. She asked George if they had an argument or anything, and he said no. What Sue gathered from this conversation with George was that George and Julie made it to Athens on Friday night. They laid low on Saturday because they were tired after the long trip. On Sunday night, they took a trip to, Sue hoped she was saying this right, Omonia Square in downtown Athens. It's very similar to New York's Times Square. It's known as the heart of Athens. It's a very busy area full of shops, bars, clubs, and restaurants. It's really easy to get lost in a crowd. Julie was in a foreign country. She did not speak the language. She could easily lose her bearings. But on the other hand, she was very independent and somewhat stubborn. George said they had been walking around, sightseeing for a while, and got hungry. He wanted to call his grandma to let her know they would be out late. They'd grab a bite to eat and then head to the bars. Julie didn't want to waste any money on food, so she was just going to grab some McDonald's, and then they were going to make their way out to enjoy the nightlife. The last thing he remembers was seeing her walking towards McDonald's on a dark, crowded street. She was supposed to meet him back at the payphone, but she never did. He waited there a few minutes and then started to get worried. So he made his way back to McDonald's. She wasn't there. He said he got scared, he didn't know what to do. So he called his grandmother back to tell her what had happened. Then he rang his mother, asking if she had heard from Julie, and she said no. He called his father, Pavlov, who lived nearby, and he told him what was going on. His father rushed over to help George look for her. After a while, they realized their efforts were in vain, so they went to the police station and reported Julie missing. George told Sue that the police didn't even seem to care. They told him it was common for people to get lost there and that she would be fine. They said she would probably make her way to the police department soon and ask for help. But George and his father did not give up. They walked around frantically, with George in tears for hours, going to each and every establishment with a picture of Julie in their hands, asking, "Have you seen her?" George told Sue what Julie was wearing: a black dress, high heels, and her hair was in a ponytail. Sue had suspected Julie had left George because, on their last phone call, Julie told Sue she missed Katie so much. She was having trouble with the language barrier, she couldn't read the newspaper, she didn't understand the street signs, anything. She was actually calling pretty frequently and even told Sue she called Katie every day. She seemed homesick, which was completely normal, so she said that maybe Julie should take a break. He told Sue she had about $200 in cash and her credit cards on her. But then he said something that really concerned her. He said that he found her passport in the car. He also explained that a cop had told him that he saw Julie, but now he couldn't find the cop, and he didn't know what to do. He couldn't even get into their apartment if he drove back home because the key was missing, and he thought Julie might have it. Sue hung up, and she immediately called Tim. When he heard that Julie had gone missing, he told Sue she was probably on her way back to the US, until he found out about the passport. That was completely out of character for Julie. She would never mess that up. At this point, they were calling all of Julie's friends to find out if anyone had heard from her. Meanwhile, George told Sue he was going to head to the American embassy. Tracy had some interesting information about the last time she spoke to Julie on January 6th, just 2 days before their trip to Athens. Julie called Tracy distraught. She was hyperventilating. Tracy couldn't understand her. She was drunk, so Tracy wasn't sure what to think. But she said Julie wanted to come home. She missed Katie way too much. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. Tracy said, "Just come back. If you're feeling that way, just come home." But through tears, Julie said she couldn't. It would be too embarrassing. She made this choice. Her friends would think she was crazy. Tim had the house. Where was she going to go? Julie said she had to be strong and just work it out. Tracy told Julie not to be ridiculous. She could come live with her just for a little while. Maybe just come back, visit, and decide what to do next. Tracy even got on the phone with George. He was saying the same thing. He was trying to console Julie, but she told George no. George told Tracy they found out there was no way for him to get out of his military service, so she would most likely have to come back to the US anyway, anytime he was away. After the phone call, Tracy began making arrangements for Julie to come back, which included her staying at Tracy's. She was keeping it to herself until she could work things out. She said the only person who knew was Julia. She called to let her know the good news. Julie was coming back. But Julia was pissed. She could never put the past behind her. She wouldn't forgive Julie for leaving Katie behind. Now, Tim lets Tracy know that Julia ran it by him. He didn't take it seriously, though he did think it was a bad idea for her to be coming in and out of Katie's life. She was just beginning to adjust to life without Julie there. That night, Julie also tried to call her mother, but Julia didn't want to talk to her, so she handed the phone to Tim. Tim told Julie it was a terrible idea for her to be coming back and forth right now. So at that point, Julie had no choice but to agree. Later, Tim remembers hearing the phone ringing, but he was busy. He was getting into the shower, so he never picked it up. This was the last time anyone from the United States talked to Julie, as far as they knew. So what happened when Tony was informed about Julie's disappearance? He admitted that Julie had called him on October 7th while George was visiting. She said George was in jail in New Jersey. She was desperately begging Tony to post his bail, which he refused to do. Julie said Julia had accused George of strangling her and that Tim was conspiring against George to have him arrested. Tony wasn't so sure that was exactly how the story went, but he told everyone that that was the real reason George went back to Greece. It wasn't on his own volition, it was in agreement with the prosecutor, and Tim had pushed for it. He didn't want George around Katie after what happened. It was time to talk to Julia and Tim. As it turns out, Julia had a different story. She said she had had enough of George. She told him he was pathetic, living in Julie's house. Grow the F up. This infuriated George to the point where he was yelling in Julia's face. Then he grabbed her and pushed her against the wall, and he wasn't stopping. She was gasping for breath, trying her hardest to pull away from this man. If Julie hadn't come into the room at that time, she probably would have died. Julie tried to pull him off of her mother, but he wouldn't stop. She finally told him, "If you don't stop, you're going to go to jail. We're not going to be able to be together." That's when he let go. Julia didn't wait a second. She ran to the phone and called 911. The police came and arrested George, throwing him in jail. That is when Julie reached out to Tony, and he refused to help. Tim jumped in to save Julie and his daughter from a maniac. He begged the prosecutor to make a deal. If Julia agreed to drop the charges, they would deport him back to Greece with no opportunity for him to stop at their house. He had to immediately get on a plane and leave. And that's exactly what he did. Julie was frantically trying to make a different plan. She called Tony and said, "Hey, can George hide and stay at your place?" That's insane. He pretty much said, no, and when he did, Julie gave him a big F you and hung up on him. I can't believe Julie was willing to take the blame for everything that happened. She jumped on a plane to Greece and followed George, saying that it was she who strangled her mother, not George, that Julia hated him and she just didn't want Julie to be happy, so she made a false report. And it was George that pulled Julie off her mother. She made George out to look like the person who rescued Julia. Who would you believe? Let's jump back to the present. Later that same day, Sue gets another call from George. He had this fear in his voice, and he tells her the truth. He and Julie had been arguing before she went missing. Things were starting to sound pretty frightening, and Tracy and Sue decided they were going to team up and do whatever it took to find Julie. The plan was to have Sue continue to talk to George, pretend like she cared about him, hoping she could coax him into giving her more information. Tracy's job was to connect with the American embassy in Greece. She was calling hospitals all around Athens, and an operator at the embassy corroborated that George had actually called, come in, and reported Julie missing. It was really difficult. There wasn't anyone who spoke English at the police station in Greece, and it didn't seem like the Greek authorities cared. However, Tracy found someone in the US that was willing to translate for them. On Wednesday, George called to update Sue. It was hard for Julie's friends not to believe that George was involved, and when he called on Wednesday to update them, Sue tried to convince him that the search was getting really serious in the US. She said that the FBI was involved, and his tone changed. But as soon as it changed, it went right back to him being grateful and saying he was glad they were doing all that for Julie. But the next thing raised a big red flag. George tells Tracy and Sue that he no longer has Julie's passport because thieves took it. Right? Okay, so her passport just gets stolen? Every possible theory was being explored by Julie's friends and family. Was it human trafficking? Had George sold her into slavery? Was she kidnapped? Had she tried to run off somewhere and gotten lost? Was she out looking for drugs and met the wrong people? What happened? A week had gone by. They were more worried than ever, and George seemed to be in this frantic state of mind. He started questioning them, asking, "What specific conversations did you have with Julie when she called you last?" I didn't think that was unusual because I'd want to know that too. 2 weeks after George had reported Julie missing, guess where he was? At the bank. And guess what he was trying to do? Get Julie's money out. But the check hadn't cleared, and this made George very angry. He yelled in the teller's face and left the building in a huff. On January 23rd, which was supposed to be the day that Julie and George got married, Julie's family put out a press release. News stations were beginning to run the story. The Trentonian got involved. They had recently interviewed Julie for a new segment called, "What Are They Doing Now?" The reporter who had done the interview thought there were gaps in the story. and he wanted to interview Julie's family and friends. He wrote an entire report that appeared on the front page of the newspaper. This was one of their own. They wanted to do everything they could to help her. The story was reaching news outlets in Greece, and this set George off. He started bombarding Sue, calling and screaming in her ear, asking why they were trying to pin this on him, insisting he was not guilty. Now, the Greek authorities were finally doing something. George went on TV, telling the same story he had told everybody else. But Julie's family noticed something. He wasn't referring to her by name, he just kept calling her the woman. Who does that? However, he was still cooperating with police. Tim finally told reporters about George's arrest in New Jersey a few months earlier. They interviewed Julia to corroborate the details. Things were really starting to heat up. Time was not on their side. 16 days had gone by since Julie was reported missing. The Greek police took George into an interrogation room, and their chief inspector started to interrogate George. He just stuck to the same story, but it's very hard to outsmart experienced law enforcement agents. After 4 long hours, George confessed that he killed Julie. He insisted it was, in the heat of the moment, that he loved Julie so much. This was not what he intended. Things just got out of control. He was crying, and he was very believable. But it didn't matter because he confessed. Julie was dead. They wanted all the details, and they wanted them now. In a taped confession, George admitted that Julie had never gone missing. He had lied to everyone, even himself. He was even starting to believe in some delusional state of mind that he hadn't done this, but he did. He told the chief inspector the entire story, how they met, how they fell in love, that he felt awful that she cheated on Tim, but the passion for each other was too strong to avoid. He felt even worse that she was willing to leave Katie behind, but it's what Julie wanted. She told him she needed to escape from Tim, and that made George feel better. But George told the inspector he did not want to be the reason Julie left him, though he felt he was. He said that the relationship was perfect, but he conveniently left out the fact that he strangled Julie's mother. Friends suspected all along that he probably did the same thing to Julie. George went on to admit that Julie wasn't happy once she moved to Greece. She began to complain about everything. She called the Greeks lazy, with bad attitudes and not friendly. She was bored. There was nothing to do in the towns, and they were nothing like she expected. The beauty of the city was outweighed by her inability to communicate, make friends, and indulge in the things she loved most about her home. She was homesick. He said he tried to be supportive, but Julie would oscillate between wanting to leave and saying that she was fine and was going to learn to live a different lifestyle for him. George even mentioned the truth, that he talked to Tracy and told her it would be best for Julie to come back home. She just wasn't ready yet. He went on to say he knew it was best if she just left him, but it was too complicated. She had her child back home, and his parents would not have agreed with all of it. The passion was wearing off, and he wanted her to be happy. So he was thinking, I'm going to force her hand. And that's when he says he figured she started to hate him. She would finally go back. They were going to have to be away from each other for 2 years anyway. He had to serve in the military. So in that time apart, maybe they would find out that they truly wanted to be together or they didn't. He told the inspector that it was his plan to become physical with her, hoping she would get the point. He said he knew Julie would never stand for it. If he hurt her, she was sure to leave. He wasn't planning on seriously injuring her. Even though George was hysterically crying, he then admitted what he did to poor Julie, the woman that loved him and left behind her entire life to take her chance on this young Greek sailor. What you're about to hear was no accident. Investigators knew that part was a lie. They suspected Julie was slipping out of George's grasp. She wanted to leave him. They had enough experience to know George was just trying to cover his ass and act like he wasn't a violent man, a monster overcome with jealousy and rage who couldn't bear losing a woman he never deserved to begin with. If he couldn't have her, no one else would. The truth is that Julie began calling her daughter Katie non-stop for weeks, every day, sometimes multiple times a day. She would cry and cry. George told the truth. She started complaining about everything. She complained to friends that she just wasn't used to this. She felt like she was slumming it. Then George admitted that his mother found out about Julie's daughter, and she was disgusted that a mother would leave her child behind like that. She confronted both Julie and George, and that is why they moved into the hotel. His mother kicked them out. Julie knew she wanted to leave. She just talked crap about Greece, saying it's not even comparable to America. On December 8th, a family member had to pry George's hands off of Julie's neck. George had had enough. He grabbed Julie during one of their arguments and began cutting off her airway, gripping her neck tighter and tighter until someone had to pull him off. Julie was shocked. It was in that moment she started to realize that she could be in real danger. She tried to run and find a police station to press charges, but George's family stopped her. They tried to convince her it was out of character for him. He just wanted her to love Greece and be happy. They said they knew he wasn't going to hurt her, but didn't he just hurt her? After this incident, they got kicked out of their hotel because other occupants complained about all the yelling. One of the maids came forward and said that they had been arguing non-stop for days. They went to stay at another hotel. That's when George caught Julie trying to call home and tell her friends what happened. He would grab the phone and slam it down each time. Julie had realized by now they really didn't have that much in common. She had never had anyone become physical like that with her. George started to get obsessed and paranoid that she was trying to figure out how to escape. The day they were planning on picking up her things, she told George that as soon as they got there, she was going to send her things right back to New Jersey. Meanwhile, George's family members were being questioned as well, and things that no one knew came to the surface. As it turns out, he was known to go into a fit of rage and become violent. People noticed he was very unstable. His mom had schizophrenia and had spent time in mental hospitals. George definitely had issues. He was narcissistic, thought he was better than everyone else, and he was very arrogant. But he was a good actor, and that's the thing. Everything was an act. He saw Julie as a possession. He was only trying to get what he could out of her, possibly her money. They couldn't get into George's mind, but this is what they suspected. When George's dad cheated on his mother, he got so violent he stabbed him in the neck with a kitchen knife and then kicked him down their stairs. His dad had to be in the hospital for several weeks. George spent time locked up in an institution for the clinically insane. They thought maybe he was suffering from schizophrenia like his mom. It was when he got out of the institution that his family sent him to a trade school, hoping they could find something that would put him on a better path. He was medicated at the time, but he had stopped taking his pills. He said they were no good and he was against them. It's sad that his family would keep this from Julie. Do you think as parents they had an obligation to let her know the truth? Why would you protect him? George's family wasn't the only one with new information. Sue had some as well. She said that when Julie flew back to New Jersey on November 8th, there were stitches on her arm. Julie swore it was because her hand accidentally went through a window, but Sue had a feeling she was lying. She told her, "Please take care of yourself, and at the very least, take some of your money and keep it in a bank account in New Jersey." George called her in the middle of this conversation. To Sue's surprise, she heard Julie telling George about her plan to leave some money in the U.S. He goes ballistic and accuses her of being selfish. On January 8th, the couple was making that long drive to Athens in the dark on a desolate two-lane highway. They were really talking to each other, and once they did, they got into yet another argument. They were in such close quarters in a car, they couldn't cool off or walk away. It was not a good situation. We can only speculate exactly what was going through George's mind, but the investigators are probably right. All of a sudden, George stopped the car and told Julie he had to relieve himself. But that's not what happened. They were in the middle of nowhere, and George knew this area really well. He knew no one would see them, hear them, or help Julie no matter how loud she screamed. He parked the car, turned off the engine, and then looked over at Julie. He said she must have known that something was going to happen because he could tell she was scared. He locked the doors, and without warning, he reached out and grabbed her throat, squeezing as hard as he could. He said Julie began to scream, trying to defend herself, and he just wanted to shut her up, so he squeezed harder. He said he wasn't in his right mind. It was like he was outside of his body and couldn't control what he was doing. She kept yelling, asking, "What are you trying to do?" He just squeezed harder and harder for what seemed like a few seconds, but it had to be at least 3 whole minutes, because that's typically how long it would take someone to become unconscious or to lose their life. It was in that moment he realized he had crushed her neck. He could tell there was nothing left in her. Her body just slid down in the seat. George said he thought he was dreaming. He couldn't believe what he had just done. The first thing that came to his mind was getting rid of her. He thought he would end his life as well to honor their relationship. They met at sea, so to the sea she would go. He planned to set her body ablaze and then throw her ashes into the water, then jump off a cliff to join her forever. That's not what happened. We know because he's here and Julie isn't. He's a coward. He told investigators that he attempted to take his life 3 separate times, with a BB gun to the neck, jumping in front of a truck, and an overdose. He insists none of them worked. I guess he didn't try hard enough. That was mean. But he tossed her into the trunk, drove to a gas station, and bought a canister of gasoline. Then he drove back close to where he had ended her life, and that's where he tried to set her on fire by 2 lakes in a secluded area. He removed her from the trunk, dragged her near the lakes, and proceeded to douse her in gasoline. He didn't hesitate to set her on fire. He sat there and watched as her clothes went up in flames, staring at her as the flames began to consume her corpse. But it was raining, so she wasn't burning. The fire wouldn't stay lit no matter what he did. He just kept pouring gasoline over her, and she refused to burn. At that point, he thought maybe he should just stop and throw her in the lake instead, but he panicked and threw her back in the trunk. He raced to his grandmother's house, and luckily she wasn't home. He grabbed a big suitcase and drove right back to the lakes. It was midnight, and George no longer saw Julie as a human being. She was just something he needed to discard. Rigor mortis hadn't completely set in, so he could move her limbs, though they were charred from the thighs up. There was a problem. He could not get her entire body to fit in a rigid plastic suitcase. Her head kept sticking out. He sat there thinking of a solution. How was he going to get rid of her? He had to get rid of the head. It's disgusting. This is a little girl's mom. She's a friend. She's a beautiful person. No matter what mistakes people think she made, no one like Julie deserves something like this. Some people may say people like George deserve this evil, but not Julie. He knew there was a hacksaw at his grandmother's house, so he dragged her back to the car and threw her into the trunk once again. He went all the way back to his grandmother's, got the saw, and drove back to the lake. It was close to 3 o'clock in the morning when he removed her once again, placing her on a garbage bag and proceeding to get to work on her head. He penetrated where the neck meets the collarbone. Once he was finished, he looked down to see that he was covered from head to toe in blood. I wonder if he washed himself in the lake. But he had finally completed his mission. But this next part is what I question the most, and it's the part that haunts me. This sicko picks up her head by her hair to look at her face to face for one last time. His face was the last face that Julie saw before her life was stolen from her, and the same face was the last to stare back at her blank eyes. Even after all the things that George had just done to her, he said that she still looked gorgeous. He just looked at her, not realizing this could be real. But when he looked at her face, he could see that last look of horror, and he knew what he did. George was not going to release Julie and let her rest until his lips met hers one last time. And while he was still holding her by the hair, he kissed her. This absolutely grossed me out. Her body was finally able to fit inside the suitcase. Once he stuffed it in, he threw it into the lake and stared at it as it disappeared under the water. George had to make sure that he was the last person to look at Julie's beautiful face. He didn't throw that in the lake. He set it down and burned it until only a charred ball was left. He tossed what was left of her inside the trunk and drove back to Kavala. He said one last goodbye to her before tossing her head into the sea. All that other stuff was a lie, and he didn't report Julie missing until a couple of days had already passed. He drove all the way back to Kavala and stayed holed up in their apartment. Then he made the 400-mile trek back to Athens just to set up his alibi. Julie never got to see the pretty lights of Ammonia Square. Tim was notified of George's confession that evening, and he did not want Julie's mom to know. He needed to find out what the hell was happening, and it was so hard being so far away. The news would get out soon enough, and there was no way this horrendous act was going to be a secret for long. Tim had to tell Julie's friends before they read the horrific, and I mean horrific, headlines. Julia had known all along that Julie was dead, and when Tim began to tell her, she screamed, "He killed her!" She told Tim that she had warned Julie, but Julie just said she was paranoid. 19 days, a whole 19 days, had passed as Julie's body lay hidden beneath the murky water of that lake. George agreed to lead authorities to where she was, and it took divers 2 hours to locate the suitcase containing her remains below 5 feet of water. I'm not going to tell you what they found when they opened that suitcase. You can use your imagination, but it shocked even the most seasoned detectives. George was immediately taken into custody, and Julie's family was notified of the discovery. Julia heard the devastating news on TV and was in complete disbelief. Julia asked how someone could do that. He was supposed to love her. What kind of love is that? They had to do whatever it took to shield Katie. She couldn't know. Her innocence would be robbed from her. She was only 3, and there was no way she would be able to understand, so they had to be strong and keep things quiet at home. But it was really hard because the media gathered right outside their house, day and night. Julie's friends and family got together so that they could console one another, praying that they could locate her head. Tim was the one who made the trip to Greece to bring Julie's body back home and lay her to rest. While George was being arraigned, he confessed out loud to reporters that he regretted what he'd done. His father hired an attorney to defend him. Why would you do that for your child if this is what they had done? His mother and grandmother had a different reaction. His mom had a stroke, devastated for Julie and her family, and his grandmother was shocked. She said it looked like they had a perfect relationship, and she was so sorry for Julie's family. Another relative reported that George's father had to be medicated because he was such a mess, but he wanted to express his condolences and how sorry he was. He wished his son was dead instead of Julie, saying she was innocent and did not deserve this. The Greek prosecutor charged George with 3 offenses: premeditated murder, desecration of a body, and evading police. The medical examiner said they could not determine an actual cause of death. There was no way to examine the neck, so they didn't know whether she was strangled or if George had done something much worse. When I told you there were horrific headlines, there were all kinds of news about Julie's death. Some of the newspaper articles that I found hurt to read. These headlines dehumanized Julie. They dehumanized these poor victims. I would hate to know that Katie could read these later in life. The Greek press was already painting Julie in a negative light, showing videos of her in her bikini. The Greek authorities said this was the worst murder that had ever occurred in their entire country. But way worse was the public reaction. The court of public opinion came down hard on Julie, blaming her for her own death, even stooping so low as to say things like, "If you play with fire, you're going to get burned." They painted her as a bad mother, unable to forgive her for leaving Katie behind. Look, I may not agree with what Julie did, but I am not Julie. Julie was not well, we know that. We don't have to be professionals to see the signs, they were there. She was abusing substances, not taking her prescription medication, and being completely manipulated by a sociopath. Let's not judge her unless we have been in her situation. And even then, take a moment to realize that we are all imperfect, and it doesn't downplay or justify what George did in any way. As I said, Katie was 3, and she was beginning to ask about Julie. She had been speaking to her frequently, and now it stopped. The family had no idea what they should do, and that's hard. I don't think a 3-year-old would be able to understand, but I hate to lie to someone, especially a child. On the other hand, if it were me, maybe I would say, "Mommy went away, but she loves you so much. and one day you'll know the whole story. What would you do? They were about to make an insanity plea, but George said he wanted to die, which was completely pointless. Because Greece didn't have a death penalty, by February 22nd, the Greek authorities had released Julie's body to Tim. But he never got the chance to confront George, and that was okay because the most important thing was getting Julie back home. What Julie's friends didn't want was for Katie to grow up only knowing the bad things that happened to her mother. So they started a journal for her and asked everyone who knew Julie to write about things they loved about her, memories that they could share. And they gave that to Tim to give to Katie. Tim was the source of strength for everyone. He cared for Julie more than anyone, all the way until the end, never once complaining. When he was questioned about what he did, he said, "It would be easy for me to say she left me for some other guy and I'm out of here. But I have a daughter, and she's looking to me to do the right thing." Now I'd like to tell you what happened with the trial and the outcome. George's trial started on Saturday, November 27th, in 1999. The legal system in Greece is much different than it is in America. There's a 3-judge panel that hears all the evidence after reading the written arguments that come from both sides. It's not a jury of your peers, so the trials only last a couple of days. The insanity defense was taken off the table, and Tim traveled all the way to Greece so that he could attend the trial in person. The prosecutors argued that the evidence showed George's plan to get rid of Julie in order to steal her settlement funds. George might have been chained to his seat, but he did not sit there quietly. He made angry outbursts during the prosecutors' arguments. Tim actually got on the stand and told the court that Julie was not just a model, not just a woman who wore a bikini. She was his love and his friend. He wanted George to go to jail for the rest of his life. George even decided to testify, which lasted around 5 hours, and it was on the last day of trial that he was still making outbursts during closing arguments as well. This man was seriously unstable. On Monday, December 6th, which coincidentally was the 1-year anniversary of Julie's move from the US to Greece, George was found guilty on all 3 charges and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now I'm going to give you some bad news. The family thought that George would never see the light of day again and would never be able to hurt another person. However, just 3 years after he was sentenced, on October 8, 2002, George appealed. He said that what he did was not premeditated. It was in a jealous rage after Julie told him she was going to leave. He pleaded to the court, saying, "I was in a haze when she said she was going to leave me. I had planned my life with her. It was in a moment of intense passion." And the court believed him. They said they could see that he was remorseful, and he had no prior convictions. After just 1 day of trial, they ended up reducing his sentence to only 23 years. Not only that, but because he won the appeal, it opened the door for George to apply for early release. After all this, the disgusting way that he carried out this crime, George was released in 2007. He's remarried now and living with his new family in Kavala. I can't believe that it finally seemed there was going to be closure, even though there really is no closure when someone we love is taken from this world so soon, and in the way that Julie had been. As far as I could tell, they were never able to officially confirm finding Julie's skull. In 2001, a partial skull was recovered in the sea near the site where she was killed. The coroner said it appeared to be consistent with a skull that had been submerged for 3 years, but they could not use the teeth for dental identification. A Greek tourist actually found the skull on September 2nd, floating about 100 feet from shore. At the end of the day, we are all human. We want the same things: love, happiness, and a long life. Julie had 2 of those things, and chasing both of them robbed her of the life she could have had if it wasn't for a manipulative monster who convinced her that the grass was greener on his side of the world.